The guild employee calmly finished the registration, handed the new adventurer a copper ID token, and expressed her sincere hope for his success in the difficult work ahead. Rorin, a swordsman who had joined the adventurers at the lowest copper rank, was amazed that the moment had finally come, even though he never expected it to happen. Though he resisted and felt regret, he couldn't change anything because reality left him little choice, especially financially. He was penniless and saw no way to survive. Thoughts spun through his head about how he had ended up at the doors of the Adventurers Guild in this city. To make sense of it, he ran back through the last few days in his mind to remember how it had started. Since childhood, his life had been tightly bound to the mercenary squad he grew up in. Over the years, he stayed with the combat team, carrying out missions and fighting alongside his comrades. And the unit followed the wars, taking part in countless victories and just as many defeats. As a mercenary, Rorin had seen a great deal and gained hard-won experience. Even the most battle-hardened squads eventually fell apart, and now theirs had. What should have been an easy, certain victory turned by a twist of fate into an unexpected, crushing defeat. After miraculously escaping death in that battle, he found himself completely cut off from his former comrades. After wandering alone, he finally reached the city and stood before the building that housed the local Adventurers Guild. Knowing that adventurers were basically traveling hired hands like mercenaries, just with a slightly different approach to their work. Joining the guild only required paying a fee. No one checked your background, past, or intentions. As a result, anyone could become an adventurer, regardless of who they had been. Only the armor he wore, a huge two-handed sword, and a few silver coins were left, and he didn't want to wander aimlessly through the streets and roads. Meanwhile, the guild received many requests to complete tasks, including killing monsters, collecting herbs and items, exploring new territories, cleaning and escorting, and that was only a small part. Adventurers were meant to be generalists who could handle many kinds of tasks. He could only take jobs allowed at the copper rank, which greatly limited his options. Alone, and without his comrades' support, his fighting skills were still sharp, but simple tasks were growing dangerous, and he wondered whether he should take on cleaning the ditches. A man appeared nearby, picked up on his thoughts, and asked if he was looking for work. The man concluded that Rorin, though an experienced swordsman, seemed confused and could not choose a task. He said their group was short of people for the front lines, though they had enough members overall, and Rorin thought that if he were still a mercenary, he would refuse immediately. He knew a mercenary was only a temporary hire, free to choose his actions but without guarantees, support, or backup in battle, and that lacking reliable cover from behind could quickly mean death. Mercenaries usually pick employers cautiously, watch their surroundings closely, and only then agree to work with them. Sometimes there are exceptions, especially when a fighter has no money at all. The man said the reward for completing the task as part of a group would be much higher than if you worked alone. Roar then clarified what kind of task they would have to complete. Pleased with the interest, he said their group had a new member and they planned to complete the task as a group of 5. Offering to introduce everyone, he noted that Rowan would now be in the vanguard with him. Rowan briefly and politely said he was pleased to meet them. Nellen was introduced first, the interlocutor's childhood friend who dreamed of becoming a real adventurer and was a thief in the guild's copper rank. Next came a mage named Okusi, whom they met on the day they registered with the guild and immediately teamed up with, and who was also a copper-ranked adventurer. They said she could use magic 3 times a day. Lauren wondered if that was truly special. Then the man asked the last participant to introduce herself. Lapis, a newly appointed priestess serving the god of knowledge, had little experience and said she hoped their joint mission would succeed. Roran confirmed he would cooperate. They met Lapis after arriving in the city and were counting on her divine spells. Lapis admitted she could only use magic 2 a day. Roran thought that sounded less impressive, and it still left him with doubts. The man who called himself the group's leader introduced himself as Sif, and confidently said he would one day be called a hero, a copper-ranked swordsman and adventurer. Nellen said with delight that Siaf was the strongest man in the world, asked her not to praise him so much because he felt embarrassed and claimed to be modest as a true hero, and, pleased that the newcomer had joined them, offered to tell the story of his journey. At 6, he found records about the hero in the archives. and that discovery greatly shaped his fate. Roran felt the group was well balanced, but he also noticed with interest that, apart from him and Sif, everyone else was a girl. Few mercenaries were women, not because of weakness but for other reasons, so he saw no problem with it. Sif's story felt like it could go on for a long time, and for dozens of minutes he spoke in detail, ending by saying that it was then he decided to become a hero too. Rowan reminded them it would be a good idea to discuss the mission itself. Naylan intervened, saying the most interesting part was still to come and Siaf's story should not be interrupted. Roran realized that having women in the group could lead to strained relations between men and women, and that he was not only on a potentially dangerous mission but also part of a socially difficult group. Roran, with a business-like, no-nonsense expression, reminded them the group had not yet discussed the mission and said they should, and he admitted he had lost his previous job and, now without income, wanted to focus on real work instead of idle talk. He said he would discuss any proposals that came his way because he needed to get to work, could not waste time on unnecessary conversations, and it would be irrational to postpone the matter. Sif, a little surprised, accepted Roran's reasoning and said that since they had found common ground, it was time to move on to the core of the task. But Naylan then interrupted, expressing doubts about whether Roran needed to be included in their group. She reminded him he was a former mercenary, and voiced concern that it might not be safe or wise to travel with a man who would do anything to earn money, saying his presence could cause problems in the group. Roran saw the familiar bias society held toward mercenaries, and Siaf stayed calm, reminding Nulan she had already agreed the group lacked a vanguard fighter and that Roran was the right fit. Naylan hesitated, then confirmed she agreed and suggested they look for another candidate, while Okusi, joining the conversation, said it was unlikely an adventurer of the right level would join an inexperienced group with no name or achievements. Roran offers clear advantages. Lacking adventuring experience, he still has real combat skills, which matter. Siaf looked to Lapis for her opinion on the new member. Lapis said thoughtfully that she did not think Rowan was a bad person and did not distrust him. Nalin immediately noted wryly that Lapis's opinion likely came from her priesthood past, where few had any idea about mercenaries. Lapis said she hadn't had the chance to learn the details about the church's mercenaries, so she judged Roran by his appearance and behavior. Roran calmly reminded everyone that being in the band was a one-time job, not a permanent commitment, so temporary inconveniences were entirely acceptable. Sensing the objections had eased, Saif asked for Roran to officially join the group, and then announced that the mission was to destroy the goblins who had settled in the forest near a village 3 days' journey to the east. Nalong explained the village was called Eion, and suggested they could drop the current request and seek a more lucrative quest there. Okusi said this might be a request to explore recently discovered ruins, but the guild usually assigns this kind of task only to proven, more experienced groups. Nalan said regretfully that in that case their group would always get only the cheapest, lowest-paying jobs. CIFE, still confident, said they would finish the available tasks and deliver solid results, after which the guild would offer them more serious missions. Roran heard this and asked how many goblins were in the forest and how large their gang was. He admitted there is no exact data, noting that villagers who encountered goblins while hunting fled immediately, and that the number in the forest does not matter because they do not pose a serious threat. Saifi ended the discussion by saying that if no questions remained, the group should set out tomorrow. Roran wanted to be certain, but Saifi had already ordered preparations and stressed that everyone must assemble at the eastern gate the next morning. Roran figured he needed enough food for 3 days and a place to sleep, but he couldn't afford medicine. The next morning he reached the eastern gate ahead of the others and saw that none of his comrades had arrived. A guard who noticed him acted as if they'd met before and asked if he had any local ties. Roran said he was just waiting for his comrades since they had to set out early in the morning. On guard since dawn, the guard could no longer sleep and was tired of standing still. Noticing Roran looked tired, he asked whether Roran had managed to get a good rest, and Roran admitted he had not been able to rest fully. The guard apologized, warned the day would be difficult, and suggested a short chat to lighten things since he was bored, then asked if Roran was in the city for the first time and called it a cafe. Roran asked whether the city was really called that, and the guard was surprised that Roran had arrived without even knowing the city's name. Roran said a series of events had suddenly brought him here. The guard accepted this and said that although coffee was not the capital, it was a pleasant, warm city with good food and kind people, calling it his hometown and asking where Roran had spent the night before. He pointed to a building on the right, at the corner. The guard smiled and said it was an old but reliable place that served good food and suggested they stop by together after work. Roran thought about the guard's words. He noted he had never had a hometown because he had spent his life moving from one battlefield to another, so he could not imagine staying in one place and calling it his own, and he supposed that might be a good thing. Teef reached the gate and saw Rorn already there. The guard asked if they were comrades. Rorn said these people were his companions for just one task. The guard admitted he did not expect much from a group whose leader was surrounded only by girls, suggesting other motives. Roran chuckled, seeing more envy than reason in the remark, but he mostly agreed. Seafask asked how long he had been waiting, and Roran replied that with everyone gathered they could set off, since it would take 3 days to reach the village. Seif suggested finding a cart to get there faster. Roran recoiled at the idea, knowing all his training had been for walking, and now, with no money, he would have to run after a cart. He wanted to know how fast he'd have to move to keep up. Lapis stepped up to him and kindly offered 10 copper coins, saying they would be enough for the trip to the village and back. Assuring him there was no need to doubt since it was only a debt, she said she hoped he might be able to help her out too someday, calling it an investment in the future. Seif arranged a carriage with a driver to take them directly to the village of Eion for 5 coins. Lapis said she was ready to leave. Thanks, Warren, he thought, realizing he had unexpectedly fallen into debt and that it probably would not end well. Seif was grateful they found transport and reached their destination, because otherwise they would have had to spend time and energy on a tiring walk. Noan admitted with relief that they were very lucky to get a ride, since walking would have wasted energy and valuable time. The driver smiled and waved off the praise, saying he was heading home light after selling all his grain. Learning they were the adventurers sent to deal with the goblins near his village, he showed interest and promised to lead them there as soon as possible, not wanting to delay because his homeland's safety depended on it. C thanked him politely for his help. Roran quietly noted that the reward for the ride could be symbolic, since the coachman was still returning empty-handed. Nalin assured them they would deal with the goblins and told them not to worry about the outcome. Warren wanted to discuss the group's plan of action, but the others viewed that initiative as unnecessary, so talking about it seemed pointless. The coachman said they would stop here for the night and leave at dawn to reach the village before noon. After finishing his explanations, the coachman wished everyone a good night and went to rest. Sif said the group should rest before the journey. Naylin rubbed her lower back and said she was tired, mentioning the cart ride had been uncomfortable. Agreeing, Sif reminded her they would be on duty that night. Rorn was surprised to hear this, and said he could not understand that 2 people in the group would have to stay awake all night. Saif explained that they would take turns on duty because it was hard to stay awake until morning without a break. Roran once again explained why there would be only 1 person on duty, since it would be logical for guards to patrol in pairs when they were out in the open and away from any walls or fortifications. He felt quietly angry because mercenaries and soldiers usually behaved that way in groups or pairs, especially at night when danger could come from any direction, and he thought that when a group slept out in the open, everyone should take part in the night watch. Nalan replied sharply that since the leader had decided, there was no point in discussing it further. Roran agreed and said that if he and Seif were on duty, they would need to decide who would go first. Seif, clearly tired, suggested that Roran take his post first because he wanted to get some rest early, and Roran nodded, saying he would wake him in the middle of the night when it was time to change shifts. Late that night, sitting by the fire and staring into the dark, Lauren heard soft, muffled voices from the tent. He realized his shift would probably last longer than he'd expected since the sleepers clearly weren't going to get up, and he remembered spending the previous night awake because he couldn't relax after losing his squad. He used to sleep surrounded by his comrades, their presence giving him peace. Now loneliness and anxiety crept in as he thought of his combat friends and hoped they were still alive, and deep down he believed that, against the odds, fate might one day bring them back together. Suddenly, Lapis appeared beside him, moving silently, which slightly startled him, and she immediately apologized, saying she did not mean to scare him. Unable to sleep in the tent beside him, she sat next to him for a while. Roran admitted wryly that insomnia before a mission was a real problem. Lapis said she wasn't sure she'd be able to sleep until it was over. She asked to stay with him a little longer. Lauren wondered whether this happened often, since he felt even night workers had to keep some discipline. He added that he understood the rush, of course, especially when someone doesn't know if there will be a tomorrow for them. Lapis smiled and admitted she wanted to say that such things rarely happen, but in reality things are different. These incidents happened all the time, and the organizers stayed cheerful. She regretted that they chose neither the right time nor the right place to indulge their desires. Her faith taught that God commanded people to be fruitful and multiply, so strictly speaking they were following the divine command, and Roran was surprised by how plainly she argued, since he expected priests and priestesses to be much stricter. Knowing there were many gods, he asked which god she served, and Lapis said her god was Kukula, the deity of knowledge, adding that gods, unlike humans, could not be easily explained, urging him to see them as pillars and symbols of higher concepts rather than as living beings. She said she did not feel fear herself, but warned her views might not please others, and advised him to be careful. Rowan thanked her for the warning and admitted that, as a mercenary without formal schooling, he knew little about theology, and Lapis then asked why he had chosen to become an adventurer. Roran said calmly and plainly that his squad no longer existed. Lapis, a bit embarrassed, apologized, sensing she had touched on something personal. Roran replied gently that nothing bad had happened, and that it happened to him often. Calmly he explained that a warrior's life has victories and defeats, and unfortunately his unit had been unlucky and was defeated, and he admitted he could have tried to join another unit and resume his old life, but events had left him far from the battlefield, so he had fled and was left alone. Arriving in the city with nowhere else to go, joining the Adventurers Guild was his only way to earn money. Lapis admired him, saying he must be very strong. She compared his sword to her waist and admitted she was amazed at its size. Roran explained calmly that it was a two-handed weapon, but it could not always be held with both hands. Training to wield the sword with both hands, he even offered to compare sizes. Lapis agreed with interest, and when he asked if she was sure, she, slightly coquettish, wondered whether she was actually thinner. Rowan realized she was clearly thinner than his sword. When she commented in surprise again, he calmly said the sword was definitely bigger. Lapis admitted, a little embarrassed, that it was obvious. It was nearly light, Roran said. Lapis admitted they had been so absorbed in conversation that they hadn't noticed how quickly time had passed. He apologized for making her spend the whole night with him. He noted that night vigils were normal for a mercenary, but probably boring for a priestess. Lapis, by contrast, said she found their conversation very interesting. Roran nodded and suggested they start preparing to leave. Lapis agreed and supported his suggestion. Noticing daylight, Sea woke up and wondered why he had not been awakened for the guard change. Roran said everything had gone smoothly, and there was nothing to worry about. The coachman announced that everyone was awake and that they could set off as soon as they had breakfast, adding it was only a short distance to the village. Once this task was finished, Roran knew he would have to find another way to earn a living. The coachman then announced they had arrived and pointed to the village of Eion. Lapis scanned the area and saw the village surrounded by a dense forest. Siaf guessed the goblins now threatening the villagers came from that forest. Roran decided to question the witnesses first to narrow the search and avoid wasting time, but Cephas urged them to go straight into the forest without delay. Roran stopped him, noting several important steps that had to be taken before going into battle, and saying that, since it was a mission from the village, they should visit the village chief first to get a better understanding of the situation. Gathering information about how many opponents there were and roughly where they were felt natural to him, and he thought it was strange and unwise to do the job without even meeting the person who hired them. Irritated by his serious approach, Nayland said sharply that the mission was clear. They had to destroy the goblins, and formalities were pointless because even the coachman could have reported their arrival. She wondered how long it would take them to finish such a simple task. Roran said comments like that were exactly why they underestimated the work. He remembered that even his former commander, who was generally disliked by mercenaries, still treated meeting the employer as a normal, mandatory part of any job, and the coachman cut into the conversation to avoid an argument, saying he would speak to the village elder himself while the group only had to destroy the goblins. Sif took charge of the formation and explained the plan, saying he would go in front, Nalan would hold the center and protect the mages Lapis and Akusi, and Roran would bring up the rear. Encouraging everyone to finish the task, he let the villagers breathe a sigh of relief and then led the group into the forest. Nalan glanced at Lauren and said they could manage without the always stressed mercenaries. Okusi, a little irritated, pointed out someone had to act as a shield in battle, and they couldn't do without that role. Lapis kindly added that she would use healing magic if anyone was injured. Lun quickly clarified that the magic was to be used only if Siaf was the one wounded. Rowan realized they had entered the forest without any information about the goblins, and would now have to wander at random, wasting time and effort. While walking through the forest, Nellen spotted some berry bushes, and smiling, said they were raspberries, and Siaf eagerly suggested picking some because they had not eaten fresh berries for a long time. Okusi spotted donkey grass here that could be used as a magical material. Lapis reminded the group that their main goal was exterminating the goblins and urged them to focus, and Roran noticed everyone was doing their own thing, making no progress, and feared the goblins might find them if this continued. Lapis said with irony that Roran seemed to have given up. Roran asked calmly if Lapis had not given up yet. Lapis admitted she felt awkward about the situation. Roran said dryly that she would have to cope. She said she was uncomfortable when he spoke to her informally. Roran tried calling her Mrs. Lapis. She said Lapis was fine and asked why he sounded unsure. Roran admitted he'd never addressed a girl by her first name and suggested she call him Roran too. Lapis chose to keep calling him Mr. Rowan and quickly clarified that she did not mean to create distance by using that form of address. Rowan replied calmly that she would address him however felt most comfortable. With a slight smile, Lapis confirmed she would keep calling him as she always had. Roran then noticed something unusual. No one stopped suddenly, and someone said she had heard a sound in the forest. Rorain realized someone was indeed approaching them, and the feeling grew stronger. Sif turned to Nalan, worried anyone nearby could be monsters. Nalan said she wasn't sure what was coming, but the sound was clear and not random. Everything escalated in an instant when Okusi was injured, which signaled a surprise attack by goblins that unfolded quickly, and Roran was indignant that the group looked away from the enemy at the worst possible moment. Lapis suggested a protection spell to shield the party, but we firmly stopped her because it was inappropriate at the moment. He quickly assessed the situation and saw which way the arrow had come. The spot was extremely unsuitable for close combat. Regretting that he lacked even a short sword, he still threw a dagger at one of the enemies, but the wound was superficial. He realized the blow hadn't been deep enough. Sif shouted that the goblins had seized the moment to retreat and were trying to flee, so he ordered them pursued, believing it was a chance to reach their lair. Roar mentally noted again that no one cared about his opinion, yet he still tried to express doubt, believing reckless pursuit could be dangerous and ineffective. Sifi insisted their mission was to exterminate the goblins, and now that they had a lead, they had to follow it or the mission would be in vain. Nalan backed him, scolding Roran for being overly cautious and saying a leader's decision should be followed, not judged, while Roran, despite his inner resistance, reminded himself the mission did not require destroying the goblin lair. Meanwhile, the group moved forward with Roran and Lapis bringing up the rear. Lapis said that although Siaf had gone ahead with Okusi, she felt more comfortable staying with Roran because the priests and mages needed protection in battle. He asked if she was sure about her decision, and she said firmly that she was ready. Roran noticed clear traces of goblin blood on the ground, which made tracking the enemies much easier. Roran went to Lapis to get her take on the group's fighting ability, especially how strong Sifu was as a swordsman. He warned that goblins breed fast and are dangerous because of their numbers, even though each one is weak, and added that if they cannot be defeated right away, a clear strategy is needed. However, he noticed the group was chaotic and slow, which did not inspire confidence in success, and added that in such circumstances one must rely on a swordsman's strength, so he wanted to see how capable Siaf was in that role. Lapis said that as a former mercenary, he had likely heard of a fighter nicknamed the Demon Swordsman, a legendary figure known to many. Roran confirmed he knew the name. He remembered that any enemy who faced this swordsman met certain death. His allies always won, and no one wanted to stand against him on the battlefield. He asked whether Lapis truly believed Siaf could measure up to a hero like that. Lapis laughed and said even 10 million sheaf wouldn't be enough to beat the man known as the Demon Swordsman. Roran shot back that such confidence bordered on madness. With a slight smile, Lapis pointed out he was in the same situation right now, and when he took in her words, he sighed and admitted he might be acting irrationally because he had no money and would have to go into debt no matter what. Lapis said with gentle irony that he could only sympathize, and Roran, surprised by her intonation, mentally noted that it was odd to hear sympathy phrased as a statement that sounded like a question. At this point, Siaf said they had found a cave that might be a goblin lair. He pointed out the blood trail led straight inside and added that even Nalon had confirmed they were heading in the right direction. Roran thought the cave was rather narrow, and he doubted going inside because his great sword would be almost useless. Nalon answered irritably that if he doubted he could make it back, he should not expect to share the reward, and Seife tried to calm him, saying the goblins were not that dangerous and everything would be fine. Offering Roran a weapon he'd picked up along the way, he hoped it would come in handy. Roran took it, thinking even this was better than nothing. Siaf ordered Okusi to use magic to light the way ahead, and Nalon to scan the surrounding area for traps or other dangers, and if nothing suspicious was found, they were to enter the cave. Okusi quickly uttered an incantation and summoned a light spell to illuminate the dark depths ahead. Ra inwardly thought that using magic to light the way wasted, limited, valuable magical energy, that they should at least have brought a simple torture lamp because it would be much simpler and more efficient, and that he had no idea what was in their luggage. After checking, Nalon reported no traps or pitfalls, and Siaf warned there could be kidnapped people inside, urging the group to hurry and rescue them. Rohan thought Chief was overconfident, because the chance of an ambush inside was still high and the traps could easily go unnoticed. Feeling safe, he ordered them to move on without hesitation, assuming the goblins had fled so quickly they left no guards at the entrance, and he thought this fortunate. Okusi said goblins were primitive creatures and, when injured, would be unlikely to organize security. Roran wondered again if they were moving too fast and not analyzing the situation enough. Lapis, walking beside him, asked him to share her thoughts about what was happening. The lack of guards at the entrance made the place clearly a trap, he said. And when Lapis asked whether goblins could be cunning enough to arrange that, Roran replied that he did not know any goblins personally, but noted that even primates left someone on duty to watch their surroundings, so he did not think goblins were any dumber than monkeys. Lapis wondered aloud about the gap between monkey and goblin intelligence, recalling that monkeys formed communities and used simple tools, which made them closer to humans. Roran noted to herself that she was unexpectedly drawn to that kind of reasoning and that her interest probably came from being a priestess of the god of knowledge. Lapis saw Siaf lost in thought and asked if everything was okay. Siaf said he saw lights in a room ahead. Roran noted that if they could see light from the room, the enemy could see them too. Nalon suggested it might be a goblin ambush. Okusi added that this would be especially dangerous if archers were inside. Nalon and Okusi were to follow. Roran shook his head again. Walking straight into a trap seemed reckless. That courage brought both admiration and alarm because the choice was essentially suicide. Despite one of the day's 3 magic uses already being spent on a direct attack, Akuse cast a defensive spell to balance the risk. Siaf thanked her and said he was relying on her magic. Lapis looked to Lauren, unsure if that would be enough. Lauren gave a vague reply, saying it was hard to predict. Lapis then asked what Lauren would do in a similar situation. Lauren didn't hesitate and said plainly that in his case, he would seal the cave entrance with fresh branches and dry grass and then set it all on fire, since the exit would be blocked and heat and smoke would pour in, making it the easiest and most effective way to deal with the ambush. Lapis pointed out the method needed oil. Roaring agreed that without oil and flint, it was hard to start a fire from raw wood. Since they didn't have those basic supplies, they had no choice but to give up and possibly retreat. He gave a quiet inward sigh, thinking how hard it was when you couldn't afford even basic equipment. Lapis nodded briefly, showing she understood. Siaf said he would go in with Roran. Roran stayed calm and reminded everyone he had no protective magic. Okusi said his huge sword could serve as a shield. Nalan agreed. Roran realized that in such a narrow cave drawing a sword would be nearly impossible, and using it as a shield, because of its weight and size, would only get in his way. Sif apologized, saying he could not cast a second protective spell because one had already been cast on him. Roran replied calmly that it was just bad luck. Roran made a mental note that he would have to survive on his own now, no matter the circumstances. Sif called out the order to move forward with enthusiasm. Roran thought such a loud call had surely alerted every enemy nearby. He told Riley it seemed like a plan to announce his approach ahead of time. The magic, he admitted, was convenient and did not deflect arrows but made them bounce off his body. Filled with fighting spirit, Siaf declared he would deal with every enemy. But before he could finish his speech, he stumbled and crashed. Nalan sprang forward to help him. Lapis tried to rush as well, but Roran stopped her in time. Nalan kept calling Siaf, telling him to get up. Lapis noticed depressions in the ground that might be traps. Roran said tensely they should be especially careful because someone in the cave was clearly capable of planning ambushes. Sif's eyes shone as he held a tattered but clearly beloved book and, in an admiring voice, said the hero in it was simply magnificent. Sure, he had found a true example to follow and a hero worthy of admiration and respect. Sif dreamed of becoming a man like him, traveling the world, doing brave deeds, and one day earning the right to be called a hero. Determined, Sif vowed to become an adventurer, honored as a hero. It was far from romantic. Nalant screamed in pain and anger as goblins sprang from an ambush and attacked. Stunned, Sefe could hardly grasp what was happening. One thought kept spinning in his head. This should not have happened. They were just goblins, not an army of demons, and he could not accept how serious it was. Roran watched closely and quickly noticed one goblin that clearly stood out. It was larger and more imposing, and he guessed it was their leader, perhaps a higher form. Lapis said some goblins are born special, and though they may begin as ordinary goblins, over time they gain experience and strength and become many times more dangerous. She says that because this goblin holds a staff and wears different clothes, it is likely a goblin mage, one of the most dangerous higher forms, capable of using magic and possessing deadly knowledge. Rohan judged it reckless to fight such an enemy without preparation and thought it safer not to approach him, but things had already gotten out of hand because Siaf and the others were already involved in the fight. Roran saw movement behind him and spun around to find enemies closing in from the rear, making retreat impossible. Okusi casts a determined spell of loose sand to put her enemies to sleep. At that moment, the goblin mage also cast a spell, producing a sudden bright flash. Roran tried to determine what kind of magic it was as Lapis fell to her knees, weak. Approaching with concern, he asked whether she could still move and what had happened, and realized she had lost almost all her strength. Okusi cried in panic that her spell had failed. No one had fallen asleep despite the magic. She begged the enemies to stay back. Safe, trying to protect his companions, rushed forward and shouted for the goblins to leave the girls alone. His defense failed and he was wounded during the battle. A desperate thought ran through his mind. He couldn't accept it because he was supposed to be a hero. Captured! Okusi cried out in despair for help, but it was too late. Roran realized the situation was hopeless. There was no way to save them, and the escape route was blocked. Turning to Lapis, he saw her lying exhausted and asked whether she really couldn't move and had no strength left. A sudden, alarming thought hit him. The enemy was closing in on both sides and would soon surround them completely. Lapis struggled to look at him and told him to leave her. Calling herself a burden, she said he could still get out on his own. Roran heard her cold, resigned words and noticed her tone was oddly calm, almost detached. Lapis said women would probably not be killed outright, while opponents would kill men without a second thought. So she insisted he leave without her. Lauren currently told her to be quiet, adding she would bite her tongue if she kept saying things like that. He remembered that not long ago she had said her place was beside him, that she wanted to be there because it felt right, and that she had lent him money hoping he could help her one day. Whispering, he told her to be patient and warned that they were about to be shaken. The decision had been made. Unable to wait, he grabbed Lapis and rushed forward, ignoring the arrows flying at them. Realizing the way back was blocked, he knew their only option was to go forward. Manachao Kamahachao, 1 marrow half. Behind the goblin mage was a narrow passage they could slip through. The goblin mage reacted, firing fire bullets at the running man, and Rorn realized there was not enough time. Leaping forward, he cut off the goblin's head in a furious strike, removing the main threat. Getting through had been a miracle for Rory, but the fight wasn't over. They could be pursued at any time. Their only chance to survive was to get away quickly. Each step made the exit feel farther away, and he worried as they pressed deeper into dangerous, uncharted caves. His only hope was that there was a detour ahead, but for now he saw only solid darkness, and thought sadly that the debts he had taken on had turned out to be damn expensive. Even tired and stressed, Lapis watched Roran move with surprising speed and ease in total darkness, as if the place were familiar, and he abruptly cut her off, ordering her to be quiet because her voice distracted him and kept him from concentrating. Lapis, irritated, compared herself to a bag being dragged and said it was exhausting to be treated that way, and Lauren stayed calm and replied that it was tiring for him too since he was the one carrying her, adding that if she wanted to survive she should keep quiet. Lapis agreed and promised not to interfere anymore, then in a softer voice said she deserved at least a little better treatment, not asking for princess treatment, but not wanting to be treated like a shapeless piece of baggage. Roran carried her onto his back, and sensing the change, she thanked him for saving her. He noted to himself that she had returned to her usual tone of speech. Lapis finally asked the question that had been on her mind for a long time: why he had saved her when he left the others. Roran did not dwell on it. Calmly he said it was his decision, and that he had done it because he wanted to, because she was lucky, and because he owed her money. He told her to pick any of those reasons, since any could be considered correct. Lapis was not satisfied and suggested he might have acted out of kindness. Roran said that if that were true, he would not have abandoned the others. Lapis said firmly that no matter what, she was the one he had saved and would call it an act of kindness, and Roran dismissed the discussion and let her hold the belief that felt truest to her. He changed the subject and returned to the strange moments of the fight, wanting to know why her speech had suddenly altered and why she had lost the ability to move. Lapis realized there was no point hiding it any longer and admitted that since he had already seen it, he would tell everything, and she began by asking whether he knew what demons were. Roran said he knew they existed and that, besides humans, the world included other races like half-beasts and demons. Demons were usually treated with caution. They had well-developed bodies, used magic, and showed little interest in other races. Demons deal with others only for their own gain, have a bad reputation, are rarely found among humans. Their mindset is different from humans, and even in his mercenary squad people thought it best to stay away from them. The church calls them apostates for rejecting a supreme god and brands them abominations. You can spot a demon by their bright purple eyes. The legendary demon lord makes the whole world tremble even though he does not try to conquer. Lapis said calmly that she was a demon. Lauren did not believe her at first. He told himself she was a priestess and did not look like a demon because her eyes were not purple. Lapis said she does not believe in a supreme god or a mother goddess as many humans do. Demons generally worship the god of knowledge, who teaches them to seek new discoveries. For demons, knowledge, including magic, is sacred. She can use both divine spells and ordinary magic. Other gods cannot do that. Usually, serving one god limits the kinds of magic you can use. Roran realized where her unusual ability came from and why he'd seen her use light magic. She was both a mage and a priestess, and he asked if human priests of the god of knowledge could also use magic. Lapis said someone might be able to do it, but it was unlikely anyone could match her capabilities, since she was a demon and her abilities were stronger than a human's from birth. Ruin realized that if magic and divine spells could be combined, everyone would become a priest of this particular god. He asked why she, a demon, chose to become an adventurer, since he had heard demons had little contact with other races and lived in the inaccessible mountains at the center of the continent, and Lapis replied that this was a common misconception, that many demons actually live in the human world. They simply disguise themselves, act cautiously, and do not use their full power. Most people do not notice them. Roran asked whether they deliberately limit their abilities. Lapis confirmed this and said it explains her current state. She added that her body is not quite normal. Lauren realized she could move her hand again, and Lapis explained that her limbs and even her eyes were delicate magical instruments powered by mana, so each movement used a lot of energy. She reminded him that he had seen Okusi fail to activate magic, most likely due to the managing effect imposed by the Goblin mage. The effect was too complex for a simple goblin to perform, so he was likely using a magical tool rather than a personal spell, and Roaring took out the pendant and held it up, thinking it might be the magical tool the goblin had used. Lapis examined the pendant and concluded it was probably the device. It was unclear how the goblin had acquired such an artifact. Fortunately, it would not be used all the time. Regaining full movement would take time, but she still controlled her eyes. Roarin understood why she had asked him to get rid of the device earlier, and since it was offline and inactive, he could keep it for now. He asked why her speech had suddenly changed, and Lapis explained that the odd way she spoke was not a local dialect, but her natural manner of speaking. With her magic drained, she could not move her arms or legs, and when she was in a critical situation, her mind instinctively switched to combat mode. Her speech and behavior changed with her mental state, different in peace than in battle. Roarin took in the information and said he understood, but he repeated that the strangeness around her was growing. Lapis revisited the recent fight, admitted that asking him to leave her was the sensible and logical choice, and thanked him for ignoring her request and carrying her anyway. She said that although demons have a bad reputation, they do not forget good deeds. Gorin nodded and said she could repay him later, but for now, they had to find a way out of these damned caves. And he still felt something was wrong with the place. Lapis agreed, saying they'd probably traveled far from where the goblins first attacked, but there was still no end in sight. Her initial belief that the goblins lived in a natural cave had been proven wrong. This place was clearly something more. Roarin confirmed her words, and he noted they'd passed many rooms that looked like goblin rooms. If they'd been through those areas before, the worst case was being stuck in the same corridors forever. He hoped they would reach the end and then find a way back. But the corridors looked man-made, too uniform and even, as if someone had deliberately formed them that way. Roarin suggested they go back. Lapis reminded them they'd have to go through the dangerous room again. Roarin quietly noted it would be better if there were an exit on the other side. Lapis said that if they really found a way out, Rohan would be a very lucky man. Rohan didn't bet on luck and told her not to count on his luck. Lapis admitted she probably couldn't live up to his expectations. She said that when she left her homeland, the demon territory, her parents gave her artificial limbs and eyes instead of her real ones so she could blend in, become an adventurer, and join the group. Hearing this, Lauren said she was probably even unluckier than he was. Lapis agreed that her only luck was being surrounded by frivolous, inconsiderate people who could not see who she really was. Lauren urged her to stop if it got too hard, but she pressed on, saying her real arms, legs, and eyes were hidden by her parents somewhere in the human lands, and she could not return home until she found her missing parts. Roarin made clear he had no intention of staging a contest to decide who was the most unfortunate. Lapis added that if she could recover her lost body parts, she could reconnect them and be whole again. He suggested she return to her homeland and ask her parents directly about everything. Lapis saw a dead end ahead and pointed it out. Roran insisted a real dead end would have no light, and Lapis guessed it might be a light at the end of the tunnel, but also feared goblins could be ahead again. Roran said he saw no sign of goblins, told her to dim the magical lights, then asked if she could stand. Lapis apologized, admitting she was a real hassle. Roran said it was okay, but warned that if any serious danger came, he would have to throw her off and asked her to be ready. Lapis agreed, understanding that in a fight she could even stop him from drawing his weapon. Roran hoped to avoid a fight. Ahead was a dead end, but a faint light shone through a crack in the wall. Lapis offered to crawl in on all fours, but immediately admitted her arms and legs barely worked, and she wouldn't dare go into the unknown alone. Roar wondered if she might get her backside stuck in that gap. He suggested breaking down the wall and widening the passage, warning they would have to make some noise, and asked Lapis to watch for anyone. Lapis promised to be careful. Rowan wondered again if he could finish the job before a pursuer arrived, assessed the wall's strength and decided he could handle it, and soon widened the passage enough to crawl through. Lapis praised him, saying that although it had taken a long time, he had done a great job. Roran said the main thing was that no one had time to come after them, ordered that he would climb first and pull her up after him, and apologized for the inconvenience. Lapis said everything was fine because they were in the same boat. Roran felt tired but gathered his strength and moved forward. He asked what she had seen because her opinion mattered to him. Lapis studied the walls with interest and admired that they were built from a remarkable material, a construction compound formed from mana. Roran clarified this by pointing to a strange glow. Lapis said it was a special building material used by an ancient civilization. No one knows how it was made, but it absorbs mana directly from the air and converts it into light. Roran froze when he heard about the ancient civilization, mentally scanning the meaning of those words. Lapis explained that long ago there was a nation that reached incredible prosperity. That nation was known for its advanced magic. Its people mastered witchcraft and ruled most of the world. At that time, the place was home not only to humans, but also to half-breeds, beastmen, and demons, and all these races coexisted, while the ruins suggest that nearly all influential figures in that civilization were magicians. Their cities rose into the air and literally hovered above the ground. But one day the country vanished and its people scattered across the globe, perhaps founding new states in other regions. Roran concluded that if these were really the ruins of an ancient civilization, everything here could be worth a fortune, and Lap confirmed the place would eventually be plundered by an adventurers' guild or by ordinary treasure hunters. Roran regretted that it didn't look very promising. Lapis looked around and suggested scraping some of the material off the wall. The light would be weak but usable, and the material was valuable for research. Rora spotted shards on the floor and pointed them out. Lapis approved of Rora's find, noting that one piece was magnificent. This reminded us that if they were actually inside the ruins of an ancient civilization, it was not a good sign. Lapis asked why he thought that. Such places, she said, could be summed up in one word: contradictory. Roran asked if she could stand up yet. Lapis said she couldn't yet, explaining that, as he had noted, those places were dangerous, but there were also entirely safe areas with no traps or threats. Roran said the most remarkable spot in all the ruins he knew was a room that looked like a toilet, and everything inside was top-notch, with a sewage treatment system, no smell, and no security mechanisms or magical traps. Lapis chuckled at how no one had thought to protect such a secluded but vulnerable place, and Roran agreed. So Lapis concluded these ruins might be harmless, and that truly dangerous places here were rarer. Roran wondered what kind of ruins these were, and Lapis felt the same. Hoping they were safe, Roran warned Lapis to stay as alert as he was. Lapis agreed to watch for magical signs and traps and asked him to handle any attacks. Roran chuckled, pointed to his sword, and said that was what the weapon was for. At worst, they could go back through the hole in the Goblin cave, and he didn't think they were that much of a threat. So the best option was to avoid fighting and calmly get to the surface. Lapis wasn't sure everything would go smoothly, and Roran agreed, saying he didn't really believe in God and didn't want to take communion. Then he gripped his sword hilt tightly and listened intently, which made Lapis wince inwardly because his abrupt gesture scared her. She called out and asked what had happened. Roran strained to hear and said someone was approaching. Lapis sized up her powers, decided she could use magic to stop the intruders, and asked for a signal at the right moment. Voices came from the side as people talked about the pair ahead, a suspicious man carrying a girl on his back, and wondered how they had ended up in the unexplored ruins, with one suggesting it might be an illusion. Another quickly dismissed it, saying they could feel heat from them, so they were real, and it was not a good place to walk. 4 people stepped in front of Roran and Lapis, and Roran immediately noticed they all wore silver tokens on their chests, marking them as silver-ranked adventurers. With a slight grin, the first man said that if they had escaped the goblins only to be lost in the ruins, it was, to say the least, an unfortunate turn of events. The group's second member said that since their squad died and the 2 of them survived, luck was on their side after all. A girl from their group grabbed the first man's ear, making him scream. He pleaded with Nim not to pull so hard because she could tear his ear off, and Nim calmly said that if he would not listen, he did not need his ears. 4 new adventurers stood before Roran and Lapis in the dusty gloom of the ancient ruins, Chuck, a seasoned fighter and silver-ranked adventurer, Nim, archer, sharp-tongued with an equally sharp gaze and also silver-ranked, Ritz, a reserved swordsman with the bearing of a commander, and Colts, an older mage in worn but well-kept clothes. Colts noticed Rohan staring at Nim, smirked, and asked if it was his first time seeing an elf. Rohan looked embarrassed, admitted it was, and apologized for staring, saying it was impolite. Colts joked that the attention was understandable because she was a real beauty, and Nim did not appreciate the magician's remark, warning that if he did not stop, she could lose her eyes. Smiling, Colts admitted that despite his age, he didn't want to lose his sight. With steely calm, Nim said she could get by with just one eye this time. Tired of their verbal sparring, Ritz told everyone to calm down, saying they were too much trouble. He got straight to the point, saying they understood Roran and Lapis's situation and that under different circumstances they could have escorted them to the exit, but they were busy with their mission. Nim added that their current task was to investigate the ruins near Aina village, and asked if they had heard about it. Rowan remembered Milan mentioning the task they had ignored while chasing something more profitable. It was clear fate had led them here, to these newly discovered, possibly dangerous ruins. Chuck noted that unexplored ruins are often dangerous, but can make good money. They tried to be first to take the task, but soon faced competition from other adventurers. Colts explained there was an unspoken competition between them and their competitors, and whoever produced results most useful to the guild would receive a bigger reward, so they could not waste time. Roran assured them he would not interfere with their work and asked only that they point out the way to get out of the ruins, but Ritz could not answer immediately and admitted they did not know the exact route. Roran said quietly that it was bad luck. Ritz quickly pointed out they hadn't lost their heads and had been writing down the route the whole time. He roared and chuckled to himself, clearly not convinced they had failed. Checking on Lapis, he saw she was being stared at openly. Ritz said he had never heard of anyone paralyzed by fear, and that the eyes of someone who had to be carried on another's back should not be that heavy. Roran got straight to the point and asked why they couldn't find their way back. Ritz sighed and blamed Chuck for failing to spot the trap. The whole group fell into the hole. They were lucky there were no deadly spikes or poison blades at the bottom, but the drop was clearly higher than the floor. Chuck said that if someone had stayed at the top, they could have pulled them out, but everyone fell through. Offended, Ritz said he would never forgive Chuck for falling on him. Chuck waved it off, saying it made little difference whether he fell on him or on the floor. Nim looked at them and said that if Chuck wanted to state his last wish, he should do so before she punished him. Chuck added with a grin that he had been in line. Ritz, returning to the topic, said that despite all their thinking, they still could not find a way out. Lauren nodded, showing that he understood everything. Ritz said they were hurt after the fall, but they had potions and recovered, so he asked a question. After assessing the situation, Lapis said she had one chance left to cast a healing spell. It was far more effective than any potion. If she waited a short time, she could use it again. These adventurers preferred not to waste their potions and were counting on her magic. Roran understood immediately that they might leave him behind and take only the Lapis. Lapis said Roran could defend himself and fight, but she could not move at all, so someone would have to carry her, which would weaken any new companion who did it. And if they abandoned her, it would happen so quickly and quietly that no one would even notice. Ritz cut in, said he'd heard everything, and challenged the idea that he and his comrades could do such a thing. Roran and Lapis replied together that it looked exactly like that, and Ritz relented, admitting they did look like villains and could not object. Nim said firmly that if anyone dared suggest leaving a man and taking only a girl, she would personally save such a person from life. As Ritz put it, if danger arises, Lapis will cast a healing spell when asked, and he will join their group until they leave the ruins, and Lapis agrees, saying she will rely on them. Ritz thanked him and confirmed they were now working together. Roran agreed cautiously. Ritz said it was time to resume searching for a way out. Roran wished nothing had gone wrong and that they had reached the surface safely, but his heart told him not to count on that. Lapis asked Mr. Roran about the burn on his shoulder from a previous clash, and Roran said the pain and discomfort no longer bothered him after he received a special healing potion, and the wound was carefully bandaged. Lapis wasn't fully satisfied and told him to let her know right away if his condition worsened, since she had 2 spells left and had kept one specifically for his treatment. Roaring realized Lapis had told everyone she only had 1 divine spell left, so she had lied to be cautious. Not sure how to react to Lapis's lie after they had agreed to be honest, he decided that until they got out, they would have to share the same fate with this silver-ranked group. Chuck found the ruins very strange because, as far as he knew, unexplored remnants of an ancient civilization usually had only undead enemies like golems or other undead. None of those enemies had shown up in the ruins, he said, and it struck him as suspicious. Rory noted this only made their task easier. Chuck said anyone who was going to show up would probably come later, since so far they'd only encountered goblins, and Lapis suggested the goblins might have come from outside through other cracks, like the one the group had crawled through. Chuck reminded them that until recently, the ruins' entrance had been tightly sealed, and only a few days ago, a group of mages hired by the man who found the ruins opened it. Only a few mages managed to remove the powerful seal, and because the entrance was so well protected, there must have been a guard or protector inside, yet they found only traces of goblins. Colt suggested the defenders had either died of old age or been killed by goblins over the long years, noting there should at least be remains here, but they found nothing except the goblins. Colts added that if the ruins were haunted like the undead, everything would look different. You reminded everyone each ruin has its own characteristics, and suggested it was worth considering what these ruins were used for. Roran admitted to himself that the ruins were indeed too confusing. Chuck suggested they set their purpose aside for now and focus on the practical task of getting out. Ritz said goblins had been spotted up ahead again. Roran asked Lapis to go down. Nim replied confidently that she could do it easily and warned them to watch for attacks from the rear. Roran confirmed he understood the order. Ritz noted there were 7 goblins, so they had the numerical advantage. Colts offered magical support if needed. Nim refused, saying they could handle it alone, and the adventurers destroyed all the goblins. Relief washed over Chuck after the fight. Rorn showed real admiration for his temporary ally's skill. Ritz replied calmly that there was nothing to brag about since they were only silver ranked, and Roran admitted regretfully that he'd been rude again while inwardly noting that although they were all adventurers, there was a big difference between him and the group. Ritz reminded Ruin his duty was to exterminate the monsters and said that even if he failed to destroy the nest, he could still claim a reward for goblins he killed by bringing ears as proof. Ruin asked if he was sure about that. Ritz agreed it made no sense for their group to keep the ears, so they should give them to Roran. Nim pointed out that Ritz was usually stingy and reluctant to share. Chuck joked that Roran would now have something to brag about to the other adventurers. Nim said sarcastically that the sky would probably fall tomorrow if Ritz had actually given anything away. Irritated, Ritz asked them to stop talking, saying he was just worried about his less experienced comrades. Lapis suggested collecting goblin ears because they might be useful, and Rorn agreed, though he realized he had taken too many. The bag was soaked in blood and starting to smell bad, and Chuck said there was no end in sight to the goblins. Ritz handed Rohan more ears. Rohan thanked him, but said he already had more than enough. Rohan noticed the others seemed completely oblivious to the smell. Lapis said she didn't care, but the stench made it impossible to breathe through her nose. Lauren added she didn't need to say it out loud because it was obvious. Nim stopped suddenly, saying she smelled something odd and that the air had shifted from goblin stench to the scent of blood. Chuck said the smell he mentioned came from the far side of the ruins, not here, so they should move on. Lapis wondered whether it was really possible to tell human blood from goblin blood, since both smelled like rust. Ritz pointed out that Nim's sight, hearing, and smell were much sharper than theirs. Chuck joked that she had a straight, needle-like character. Nim hit him back. Ritz told them to stop being ridiculous. He tried to justify himself, saying everyone was tense, and maybe they should relax a little. Ritz ordered them to move more carefully and asked if the young lady could keep moving. Lapis apologized and said she needed a bit more time. Ritz said no matter how long they'd known each other, it would be best for her to return to the temple when she could. Rorn replied it was her decision, and he had no say. Chuck suddenly called the others over and pointed at something terrifying. Nim saw the leather armor soaked in blood. Ritz noticed how much blood there was, and said it was still bright red, which ruled out that it was old. The cult said their competitors had gone to these ruins and might have ended up here too, and that someone among them wore leather armor. Annoyed, Nim said Ritz and Chuck were acting too carelessly and that Colts was acting like an idiot. Colts insisted he was not an idiot. Nim wanted to hear Rowan's opinion. He was surprised she hadn't asked her comrades. Nim said they could puzzle it out among themselves, but she wanted his view on who owned the armor. Rohan concluded from the amount of blood that the owner was probably dead and may even have been torn apart right there. Nim said the armor belonged to their rival, a female burglar named Vora. Lapis pointed out they had only encountered goblins in these ruins so far, and that the one they found was a woman. Nim asked what she thought of that. Lapis said it was strange. If the armor belonged to a woman killed by goblins, that would be unusual, because normal goblins do not behave that way, and Nim agreed, adding there must be more than just goblins hiding in these ruins. Lapis said they had only run into goblins in these ruins so far, and stressed that ordinary goblins usually did not kill women because they knew what to do with captured women. She concluded that if the armor found earlier belonged to a woman who had still been killed, something abnormal was happening with these goblins. She added that if the victim was still alive, ordinary goblins would first play with it and then drag it to their nest. Ruarit concluded that more than goblins lived in the ruins and thought others should assume that now. Nim approached Roarin, reminded him of the hole they had used to enter the ruins, and asked whether he remembered its location. Roarin said the road ran only one way, so it was easier to navigate, and Nim agreed, telling Ritsu she felt something odd in the area and thought they should go to the surface and regroup. Ritz asked for a moment and said he knew something was wrong with the ruins, but he did not think a single piece of bloody armor was enough reason to retreat. He said he needed a stronger reason to justify a retreat, since going back for a single piece of equipment wouldn't be convincing. Chuck suggested they at least try to find the competitors' dog tags to justify a possible return. Ritz accepted the plan and ordered them to stay extremely vigilant, warning that a return was out of the question for now, and that it had been clear from the start this was no easy task, and that if they found the competitors' tokens Chuck had mentioned, they could discuss another solution. NEM agreed with the stated position. RITS was ordered to keep moving forward and stay fully prepared. Lapis walked up to Lauren and used his name. Lauren asked if she felt better. Lapis said she felt better and thanked him for helping her. Ritz asked if she could walk normally again. Lapis said she felt fine and enjoyed being on Mr. Roran's back so much she wanted to keep going, but she knew she shouldn't burden him further. Curious, Ritz asked whether they had any special relationship. Roran replied at once that they did not. Lapis smiled and said they were working on it. Chuck said happily that Roran had won the heart of a real beauty and was a good boy. Nim hit Chuck and said sharply that if he wanted to attract attention to himself, he should do it alone. Chuck said sarcastically that he would probably die first at Nim's hands and then by a monster's claws. Ritz turned to Roaring, asked if he would join the battle, then ordered him to watch the rear and said the young lady would go with him, and Lapis said they could rely on them, adding she thought it had been hard on Roaring. Noting they had been tasked with investigating the ruins of an ancient civilization, she reminded them that such work was not usually given to copper-ranked adventurers, and Roran told her she should understand the situation they were in now. Lapis admitted she was scared, and Roran said it was too much and told her to leave. He noticed that no one around her had paid attention to her behavior, then said he understood her enthusiasm, but asked her to show more restraint. Lapis agreed, then moved to the next question and asked what their goal was now. Nim said their main task was to explore the ruins, and it was also important to find out what happened to their competitors, with both being top priorities. Lapis agreed and suggested going back to the hole they fell through. Ritz asked why that was necessary. Lapis suggested the pit was a trap to catch outsiders, and because it wasn't deadly, the whole level was likely designed for the same purpose. She suggested the monsters were likely left there to deal with intruders, and added that, despite its complexity, in different times and countries, it was always clear how to deal with fools who invaded someone else's territory. She recommended postponing these sensitive topics for now, and said there was nothing really important at this level. In her view, exploring it was pointless if their real goal was the ruins, and Ritz wondered why they would return to that same pit. Lapis said she thought there might be a hidden maintenance passage under the trap where everyone who had fallen might have gathered, and maybe it was the way up, and Nim said it was worth considering since there were no other ideas. Chuck remembered not noticing anything suspicious there, but said that if the trap wasn't deadly, the exit was probably well camouflaged and he might simply have missed it. Ritz grinned and reminded them it was Chuck. Chuck sighed, admitted he had no argument, and agreed to go back and explore the spot where they had fallen through. After consulting the map he had drawn, Colts pointed out the direction they should go. Later, he reported they had arrived at the place. Roran noted the room's ceiling was very high and suggested the pit closed like a lid. At first glance, nothing seemed remarkable. He wondered whether there really was a passage up here. Chuck confirmed what he suspected and said he was a silver-ranked thief, so he'd notice anything hidden. Then the passage suddenly opened. Moran asked, surprised, what exactly Lapis had done. She said the control panel was tucked among the mana materials and hard to notice. Chuck said reproachfully that his older comrades should have noticed a detail like that. Colts called Chuck a fool, and added that the thief should at least have found the trap beforehand. Roran admitted he doesn't fully understand those subtleties. Nim quietly pointed out a staircase ahead, and Ritz confirmed it, suggesting they all go up. Nim turned to the others and said he was ready to act. Chuck inspected the sturdy ladder and decided it was safe to climb. He said he would climb first and argued that if a monster met him at the top, there was a chance he would hold on and not fall. Her grasp of the seriousness and Chuck's arguments showed she was determined to see it through as if on a final journey, and urged him to fight. Chuck, slightly doubtful, voiced uncertainty and asked if Nim was confusing anything about what was happening. Watching their exchange, Roran concluded that everything they had done had been useless, as if their efforts had brought no benefit. After reflecting on what had happened, Lapis concluded that if those people had found their way back and managed to rise, their paths most likely would not have crossed, and that could be called luck. Chuck said everything was quiet up there, and assured them no one was there, suggesting the others go up one at a time and ask who would dare to follow. After assessing the situation, Lapis suggested they wait a little. Roran, not sharing her optimism, urged caution and said it was too early to celebrate. He reminded them that most likely after the ascent, they would be ordered to return, because they would find themselves at the same level where Ritz and the others had fallen, so they already know a possible way out. Lapis admitted she had not anticipated this turn of events, and regretted losing her unique chance to explore the mysterious ruins because it would have required climbing up. Lapis suggested there might be nothing important left on this level, and Roran admitted he wanted nothing more than to leave the dangerous ruins at once, but his duty and the situation kept him there. Roar paused, thought, and spoke aloud about what they could offer that would be useful in this situation. Lapis thought for a moment and replied that, apart from divine spells, it was a difficult question. Ritz admitted the climb was difficult. Lapis said that suddenly claiming he could use magic would raise suspicions. Roran suggested thinking about what knowledge or skills might help. Lapis said that if she could figure out what this place was, she could at least make a rough map of the area, and he was visibly surprised and genuinely admired her ability. Lapis explained that no matter where you go, guild buildings are almost identical in architecture, and while some details vary by workers' choices, the buildings generally follow a unified structure. She pointed out the same rule applies to ancient ruins, since past civilizations built structures for specific purposes and used repeated architectural patterns, and Roran was intrigued by possible exceptions to that rule. Lapis noted that, as with any system, there are exceptions, and sometimes you find unusual ruins that differ from typical buildings. Ritz had already begun to speak when Chuck suddenly jumped down and announced the situation had worsened dramatically. Warning everyone that the goblins were attacking, he urged the others to jump at once. Trying to understand the situation, Rowan voiced alarm. Nim realized with horror what was happening, noted they were still looking at the same ruins, and wondered how so many goblins had managed to hide here unnoticed for so long. Ritz admitted he had no idea what was happening, saying the goblins had appeared out of nowhere and he couldn't tell what kind of attack it was. Chuck, openly afraid, said he did not want to die at the goblins' hands. Nim took matters into her own hands and told him to be quiet and run, saying they had no choice but to flee. Roran realized they were in danger again, and knew that with so many enemies, one wrong turn could get them lost and let the goblin horde overrun them. It would lead to an inevitable end, which he found completely unfair. Colts managed to say he could not move anymore. Lapis added that her strength was gone as well. Nim called to Colts and Lapis, concerned and hoping they were okay. Chuck warned them not to stop, since stopping could mean death. Rory realized his comrades had no strength left, and worried Lapis hadn't restored enough mana to keep them running for long. Approaching them, he scooped Colts and Lapis into his arms and ran without slowing. When Chuck asked how he felt, Ron replied with concern that he was used to this kind of thing, explaining that mercenaries often carry wounded comrades, though he admitted he hadn't slept much in the past few days. He told himself it was really hard. Colts, barely able to speak, apologized to Roran and promised he would certainly repay him for his help, and Lapis, barely able to breathe, apologized to Roran for causing him trouble again. Roran said they should not waste their last strength on running, and should focus on escaping with the fewest losses, warning that if he grew tired they would be caught. Lapis approaches Colt and proposes using a fireball to cause mass destruction. Colts assessed the situation and said that, again, such a huge number of opponents made the spell ineffective, so he could not recommend using it. Lapis suggested building a stone wall to stop the enemies. Colts said it likely could not block the whole passage, but would try, noting there were too many enemies and it would not hold them off for long. Lapis suggested using Firestorm. Colts said he could cast it only twice and questioned whether that would be enough. Lapis admitted it would not be enough but still praised Colts as a truly skilled wizard. The Colts pointed out that Mrs. Lapis also had insight into magic. Roran cut them off sharply and ordered them to stop their useless chatter. Quietly, he hoped they could find some way to escape the approaching threat. Roran turned to the others and said he hoped someone already had an idea for getting them out of this situation. Lapis replied that, unfortunately, they lacked the physical strength and the resources to fight such a huge number of goblins, so there was no hope of success. Chuck said in despair that they would all be eaten if that happened. Horrified, Lapis said she and Lady Nim would likely be captured and used as breeding stock. Colt said darkly that the woman from the other group had apparently been killed and eaten, confirming Lapis's fears. Ritz snapped, telling the others to keep their composure and some dignity. Nim, her voice weakening, said she felt increasingly worse and could not hold out much longer. Chuck offered to help her, saying he would carry her himself if it would buy some time and improve their chances of rescue. Nim thanked him and said she'd rely on him completely if things got really bad. Chuck looked at her and admitted things had already become really bad. Desperate, Warren searched for an escape and concluded that salvation might lie in the very stairs they had started from. Knowing there was no clear solution, everyone's strength was running out, and any of them could lose touch with reality at any moment. He thought that if they kept running without a plan, they would probably die. And although he wasn't fully confident in his proposal, doing nothing was clearly worse. Roran said aloud he couldn't be sure of the exact way out, but he had some concrete suggestions and reminded the others of the road they'd run along earlier. Ritz tried to retrace the route but realized he'd forgotten it and thought Chuck should have remembered, wondering if they could get back to the hatch where the goblins had come pouring out. Chuck noted they could not go back the same way and would have to find other routes through the passages, then asked what Ron planned to do when he got there. Roar was confident that since so many goblins had come down from there were probably almost none left above. He figured the whole group had jumped down and couldn't come back the same way, so they'd have to use the ladder and the enemies would not be able to attack all at once. Chuck realized the goblins wouldn't just wait for them to start climbing, and he knew being cornered in the narrow passage would mean the end. Roran asked if the Colts could use magic to buy more time. The Colts focused and decided to try to burn the opponents up front with a firestorm, then block the route with a stone wall. He said he was ready and they could rely on him. After listening, Ritz said it probably would not stop such a crowd anyway. Roran said confidently that if the stone wall held, they could climb over it. Roran added that if they did not make it in time, he would shield them himself. After all, it was his idea. Ritz was surprised and objected, doubting that Rowan could single-handedly face such massive opponents. Rowan said the firestorm in the stone wall would form a barrier and that he did not expect many enemies at once, so he urged the others to get up quickly to prevent the worst. Ritz agreed and told Chuck to lead everyone to that hole. Chuck nodded and pointed toward where they needed to go. Ritz warned Colts to start preparing to use magic, and Colts replied that he was ready. Ritz said that when they reached the spot, Chuck would climb up first, followed by the support team, and Ritz, as group leader, would stay to protect the others. Roran listened and calmly said he appreciated the recognition, but would carry out the task himself. Ritz disagreed, saying Lauren was too slow because of his gear, and by the time he climbed up, the goblins would have time to gut him, and with support from above, he could jump up quickly. Roran reminded him that being an adventurer was new to him, but that he'd worked as a mercenary before, said he was tired of others covering him on the battlefield, and suggested he rely on Roran. Chuck said no one else was falling out of the hole. Ritz took it as a good sign and urged everyone to stand up quickly because the goblins were closing in, then ordered Colts to use magic. Colts began the spell by calling up a raging maelstrom of fire, then summoning a firestorm and finally raising a massive stone wall from the ground. Ritz ordered us to climb immediately. Roar mentally noted that this was exactly how a silver-ranked mage acted, quickly, powerfully, and precisely. Watching the scene, Ritz grew annoyed because the goblins' actions were clearly inadequate. Rowan observed that the magic lasted only briefly, but the flames were hot enough to leave warmth behind. Rowan added that goblins are not usually known for their intelligence, but he'd never seen them pursue their prey so fiercely. Realizing there was no more time for discussion, Ritz shouted at Roran to stop arguing and get up immediately. At the same time, the goblins broke through the stone wall. Roran, stay below and help hold them back. Ritz looked up and yelled for Colts to move faster, while Colts, concentrating, said he was trying. Roran knew he could not avoid the fight. Chuck scanned the area and saw no enemies nearby. Chuck offered his hand to help Nim up and was pleased when it worked. Nim smiled weakly and thanked him for his help. Chuck tried to cheer her up, telling her not to worry because they were moving now. Roran looked up and demanded why the others had not climbed yet with time running out, while Ritz stayed calm and said it was only a short distance and they were almost there. Nim spotted Chuck and called to him, pointing out where he was. Chuck tensed and warned that the goblins were coming again, then turned to Lapis for Ritz's help and asked Colts if the magic was ready. Out of breath, Colts said he had only one chance left to use magic. Chuck suggested staying to hold off the goblins until Ritz and Roran could get to the upper level. Roran fought off his attackers and realized he was killing goblins one after another, yet their numbers did not fall, so he kept his footing to avoid slipping in pools of blood or tripping over bodies. One odd thing stood out to him. There were far fewer corpses on the ground than there should have been. From his observations, when the goblins fell from above, they crushed each other in the crowd, so many should have died. Arriving at the site, he found almost no bodies left and wondered what it meant. Maybe the goblins had carried off the bodies of their fallen comrades. Why they did it was unclear. Lapis called to Mr. Rowan and got his attention. He checked that everyone had made it up, and she confirmed they had, but warned that several goblins up there looked unusual to her. She warned that the group was holding off the onslaught for now, but the situation was getting worse by the minute, and they could soon be cornered from both sides. And Lauren snapped, annoyed that goblins were appearing everywhere as if someone was deliberately drawing them here. It hit him that he had to get to the top as fast as possible, or it would be too late. When he reached their level, he immediately destroyed the ladder they were climbing. Roran asked what it was like up there, and what was happening. Lapis said Chuck was injured and Ritz was fighting the enemy. Then she noticed Nim's condition and grew worried. Roran wondered who the black goblin he had seen really was. Nim focused his mind and sensed the enemy had no fear, which was alarming. Lauren hit the goblin, saving Nim from an attack. He realized he would have handled an ordinary goblin long ago, but this one was different. His skin was so tough it seemed impossible. Nim seized the moment and struck the goblin in the eyes. Roran figured that while the skin was tough, the eyes were far more vulnerable. He warned that if one blow did not kill him, he would keep hitting him until he fell. Lapis warned that another goblin had appeared on the other side. Ritz cried out as the enemy grabbed him and squeezed his bones. Ron asked Colts how his magic was doing, and Colts admitted his powers were completely drained, so he couldn't cast even basic spells for some time. Roran then attacked the second goblin to save Ritz. Together they destroyed their opponents. Colts, breathing heavily, said the black goblins had appeared suddenly, that arrows were useless against them, and that Chuck was wounded while trying to protect Nim. Ritz said that was when he managed to get upstairs. Concerned, Nim apologized to Chuck, saying she thought she was to blame for what had happened, and Chuck cut her off, telling her not to be so modest since it did not suit her and that caring for the womb was more important now. Roran asked Lapis if she'd found anything important, and she said she had a hunch that, if true, made the situation far more serious and meant they were in extremely dangerous, ominous ruins. Roran repeated herself to confirm they were talking about those nasty ruins. Lapis asked Mr. Ritz for permission to check something. Surprised, Roran asked whether Lapis wanted to stay here. Lapis shook her head and said the ruins must be explored, warning that if they stayed active, the consequences could be catastrophic. But first they had to leave the area immediately or they would be attacked again. Ritz agreed with her, saying he did not want to run into those black goblins again. Lapis suggested casting a spell. Chuck stayed calm and said it wasn't necessary. The medicine was already working and he was just dizzy from the blow. Lapis advised he should definitely see a doctor after returning because blows to the head can be dangerous. Chuck agreed, promising to follow her advice once they returned. Ritz asked whether he could walk on his own. Chuck dismissed the question as nonsense and said they should simply order him to move if they needed him. Nim stepped in and calmly said there was no need to force things. Chuck replied confidently that he was fine and not to worry, adding that he had been hit on the head and briefly knocked out, but could move normally now. Colt admitted he was worse off. All his magic was gone, so he could no longer fight. Chuck said no one blamed him. Ritz said that if Colts had not destroyed the Black Goblin, the consequences could have been unpredictable, and thanked him. Ritz then suggested leaving the place as soon as possible. Roran watched Lapis, thinking he moved as if he knew exactly where to go, and turned to him to ask what the creatures were, since their skin was unusually hard and their bones very strong, wondering if they were a higher species of goblin. Lapis suggested they were hobgoblin-like but much larger, while Roran argued that simply being taller did not explain the change. Lapis turned to him and asked whether he had noticed anything else unusual. Roran remembered the goblins collecting the bodies of their dead kin and doubted they were doing it for food. He was alarmed by the local goblins' behavior because it was clearly different from usual and there were too many of them. Lapis agreed with his observation and confirmed the goblins were unusual. Roran said he thought such people were found only in these ruins. Lapis changed her tone and unexpectedly asked if he was interested in pharmaceuticals and alchemy. Roran said he had heard of those fields, but none of his acquaintances were interested in them. Lapis said it was enough to simply know they existed, adding that pharmacists and alchemists experimented on living beings. Roran pointed out that new drugs were usually tested on lab rats. Lapis asked if he knew why they used rats in those experiments. Roran said a mere mercenary was unlikely to have that knowledge. Lapis said the reason is simple. Rats grow fast, reproduce rapidly, and have large litters, so they are convenient subjects for research. Roran noted the same traits, rapid reproduction, fast growth, and many offspring, and said they closely resembled goblins. Lapis confidently confirmed his suspicion, and suggested that ahead of them there might be an actual research laboratory where experiments were carried out specifically on goblins. Lapis pointed out that goblins were easy to raise because they were undemanding and needed no special conditions, and she stressed that experimenting on them did not cause remorse since they were primitive yet shared some human-like traits. Convinced the goblins were ideal for experiments, Lapis said there were no better subjects, and from how they were used, she concluded they were in a real laboratory. Roran repeated the word laboratory and was surprised by their simplicity. Lapis said goblins truly ate everything, from garbage and trash to dead bodies. Ancient records show goblins cut waste by up to 80%, an astonishing result. Roran agreed that goblins were very unpretentious. Lapis went on, noting that the ancient civilization's representatives saw goblins as scum, regardless of their numbers, and that breeding had produced different species among them, apparently as a result of experiments. Roran wondered if these different creatures were the same ones they'd encountered before. Lapis confirmed the ancient ruins were a goblin breeding ground. At that moment, the group was hit by another wave of goblins. Lapis said it was worse than breeding because here goblins were not only bred, but also deeply manipulated. Roran didn't understand what Lapis was talking about, so rejoining the conversation, Lapis explained it was not an ordinary farm, but a place where deliberate modifications were being made, and possibly where evolutionary processes were taking place. Roran asked her to explain. Lapis said in simple terms, they were studying ways to make the goblins stronger, and noted that many goblins were chasing them, but none showed an evolved form, which she found suspicious. Her theory was that the goblins here had been modified so they could not develop into higher forms, such as hobgoblins or goblin mages. The researchers had deliberately removed the chance of those forms appearing, considering them useless. Roaring worried about their size, since the goblins they'd seen were huge. Lapis said calmly that even the larger ones were still just goblins. Guests shouted that the goblins they met outside had slipped through the cracks, and one of them was a goblin mage, and Lapis clarified that inside the ruins, the goblins' changes were limited. Once they went outside, they began to change. She said she believed the ruins had been dormant for a long time, but at some point they were rebooted. Either someone outside activated the system, or an open passage triggered the processes to restart. Roran wanted to know why leaving things as they were would be bad. Lapis said the large black goblins were upgraded versions made at the facility, but their behavior worried her most. And when Roran asked what concerned her, she suggested the goblins here might not need to reproduce in the usual way. She figured the ruins hid a device that bred new goblins, so there was no point in raising the young naturally, and they killed any female adventurers they captured. One disturbing incident stayed with her when a goblin attacked Mrs. Nim and tried to tear off her clothes. Lapis stressed that this behavior could not be explained by a biological urge to reproduce. She suggested this goblin might be a human-goblin hybrid, possibly the result of crossbreeding linked to a rival of Mr. Ritz and his group. Lauren bristled and said the creature should not be called a goblin, but Lapis insisted it remained a goblin at its core, arguing that even with a human mother, people would not call such creatures half-goblins, and that any human part did not change that. Worst of all, the process of strengthening and improving the goblins was happening here. The local specimens already had intelligence comparable to humans and could learn. Roran fell silent as he absorbed what he'd heard. Lapis reminded them they had already discussed the goblins' strange habit of collecting the bodies of their fallen comrades. She thought these bodies were likely recycled into new goblins, and using the bodies of more experienced goblins produced even stronger offspring, so if the cycle kept repeating, it could eventually yield a goblin stronger than a dragon. Such a goblin would have not only physical strength, but also vast knowledge and extensive combat experience. So Lapis asked Roran what he thought would happen in that case. Roran blurted out how to turn off the ruins, but Lapis admitted she no longer had an answer, leaving him quietly disappointed as he realized he had placed too much hope in her and had expected she would know how to stop them. Lapis added that every ruin was different, so there was no single unambiguous way to turn one off, and she said it was not a matter of her lacking knowledge, while Roran, slightly stunned, quietly uttered something as he tried to express his state. Lapis noticed his reaction and said she did not like the look on his face. Roran paused, imagining how he must have looked and wondering where they were headed next. Lapis said they would first head to the private rooms once used by the ancient inhabitants, since some furnishings might have belonged to the rulers and could hold instructions or documents explaining what was happening. Roaring was surprised to hear that people actually lived here. Lapis said teleportation magic could connect cities and research centers, but it needed huge amounts of magical energy to activate, and she doubted it was worth spending those resources. Lauren admitted he wasn't sure it was worth the effort. Lapis added that if the ancients used teleportation, they likely built a full residential complex that would let them stay there for long periods. Roran doubted it, but Lapis insisted the living quarters had to exist because researchers and other staff could have lived there. She planned to search the area for materials to find a way to shut down the ruins. If anything useful turned up, she would gladly keep it. Roar warned her not to make so many bold claims about theft. Lapis said the owners of this place had been dead for centuries, so theft did not apply. Roran shrugged, saying it would be wise to gather everything of value, and Lapis agreed to do it, assuming that if the place had once been deactivated, the ancient civilization had done it, and the records about the ruins might not be all in one place. Roran asked what to do in that situation. Lapis replied briefly that she did not know what to do if that was the case. Roran knew the situation was still dangerous. The party could run into the goblins again at any moment, Chuck was wounded. Colts had used up his magic and could no longer fight. Ritz and Nim were still strong, and exhaustion was closing in on him. His weapon was near its limit and would probably break if he cut through 2 or 3 more goblins, so Lapis, hearing this, suggested he consider replacing it. Rohan said he'd decide later, after the weapon was completely disabled, but for now, getting the information mattered more. Lapis agreed that the information was important. They finally reached the living quarters. Mocking, she announced they would now begin rob. Rorn hesitated and asked if it was safe, since there could be traps. Lapis reassured him she knew about these ruins, so he did not need to worry. Ritz asked hesitantly whether this was acceptable. Lapis opened one of the rooms, looked around, reported with disappointment that there was nothing useful there, and suggested they go to the next one. Roran looked at her and said she was doing it better than the others, so she was worth relying on. Nim looked around quietly and realized they were in the dwellings of people from an ancient civilization. Ritz said everything around them was the people's legacy and suggested they take what they found and leave, since their mission was just to inspect the ruins and the information they had was sufficient. Lapis didn't object, saying no one was stopping them from going back, and Ritz suggested they go together because the group didn't fully understand what they were facing and needed to tell management so it could make its own decisions. Lapis chuckled and said they'd have to call people of gold and mithril rank, and it would not be easy to gather them. Ritz admitted to himself that only a few hundred people in the world were gold-ranked. Only a few dozen were mithril-ranked, and fewer than 10 held the highest scarlet gold, making this far from easy. Lapis said if they wanted to leave, she would not stop them, promising to pray for their safety, but warning there was nothing good waiting for them in the ruins. Roar noticed that her words sounded rude. Lapis said you can't force anyone to come with you. Ron chuckled and asked if he should follow her. Lapis looked puzzled and asked if he really wasn't going. Roran said they were in the same boat now and he couldn't leave. Relieved, Lapis admitted she couldn't have done it alone, thanked him, said she had good news, and Roran asked him to tell her the news. Lapis happily reported that she had managed to find records about the ruins, and they included instructions on how to disable them. Rorn, surprised by her own skill, said she could read the ancient language, and Lapis proudly reminded her that she was a priestess of the god of knowledge. Rowan smiled and asked whether all the priestesses of this god were so smart, and Lapis said there were many smart people in the world, but people like her were special. So Rowan got down to business and asked what they should do next. Lapis said she believed there was a control room nearby, found a panel there that could shut down all processes, and suggested they go immediately. Ritz overheard the conversation and asked whether they'd really found anything. Lapis confirmed it and said they were lucky, then turned to Mr. Ritz and asked what he would decide. Ritz replied firmly that they would go together, and Chuck added they would have a better chance of survival that way. Lapis approved and urged them to hurry to the control room, saying that once they were there they could stop everything that was happening. One man remembered arriving at the guild as a newcomer, and on that same day, in the same branch, a man named Ritz also registered. He and Ritz began the journey together, and though they rarely crossed paths afterward and lost touch, he still heard Ritz's name by chance and remembered it. And over time, Ritz became a constant topic that the man kept hearing rumors about despite himself. Maybe Ritz was valued more or something major happened on a research assignment, but their paths split. And though they started the same, Ritz rose faster, reached silver rank before him, and he had to accept that Ritz had become his eternal rival. Noticing his thoughtfulness, his comrades began teasing him about Mr. Ritz and mocking his claim that he had heard about him whether he wanted to or not. He abruptly told them to be quiet. He admitted he was grateful for the unexpected chance to prove something not only to others, but also to himself. Later, one of the women on the administrative staff said they needed to survey the ruins near the village Vine, and to be more efficient they assigned the task to 2 silver-ranked groups at once. She said payment would depend on how much information was provided and on its quality, and the man made a mental note that this was a great chance to find out which of the 2 was better. When Ritz introduced himself as the leader of his group, the man reacted at once, irritated by Ritz's calm confidence and determined to show he was no worse, inwardly preparing a worthy reply so he would not give in. A team member, clearly pleased, spoke up that the real Mr. Ritz was standing before them and that she was glad to meet him, and another comrade said it was a surprising coincidence. The same girl turned to Nim and admired her beauty, saying all elves are beautiful. Chuck, standing nearby, commented on that and called the girl beautiful. Another team member said he had heard of Mr. Colt's skillful magic. Ritz frowned and demanded an explanation, wanting to know how they knew so much. The man's comrades admitted that rumors about Ritz's group were everywhere and said their leader was a big fan of Ritz. Irritably, the man tried to defend himself. He flatly denied being a fan and said he only remembered that they started at the same time. He reminded them he had already named Ritz his rival for this mission, and added that since he had the chance to speak, he would not miss the opportunity to get acquainted. He spoke loudly to Ritz, telling him they had become adventurers on the same day, and that Ritz had moved ahead since. Admitting he admired him at least a little, the man issued a challenge. If their group proves better at exploring the ruins, Ritz will remember him as his rival. He then called his comrades and led them forward. One of his companions asked whether he would introduce himself properly. Someone else noted that Ritz looked genuinely impressed. The man spoke quietly, wondering if he could get past them. The companions answered confidently that they would win, promising the moment the rival recognized him would come, and one said they would be there that day while the man voiced his certainty that they would prevail. Chuck, watching the proceedings, quietly repeated the word rivals, and Ritz nodded. With the competitors gone, Ritz's team discussed how to respond to the challenge. They decided the main priorities for exploring the ruins would remain speed and quality of work. The best team would receive a larger reward and recognition. In essence, the conditions remained unchanged. Ritz said aloud that maybe he should find out the challenger's name. When the situation changed, Nim sadly suggested they try to find that group's tokens, so they could at least bury them if needed. Lapis said they had finally received instructions on how to build these ruins, so now was the time to act immediately. Insisting they hurry, she said the faster they reached the so-called control room, the sooner they could stop what was happening around them. She said the facility's former administrator was a decent, responsible, and reasonable person. There were no strange secrets or locks with baffling activation conditions. Lapis said if he had been more secretive and cunning, she would have to consider who he really was and how to make him reveal the whole truth. At that moment, Roran silently wondered how Lapis had learned so many details about the structure and purpose of those ruins. And although he found it interesting, he had a gut feeling he would not like the answer, so he chose not to ask unnecessary questions. Lapis, sensing his mood, said calmly that all this information came from books. Ritz looked around, reminded everyone no one knew when the goblins would return, and said he was unhappy with how dirty and unpleasant the job was. Roran couldn't help but agree. Lauren figured they had been sent on a routine exploration, but they had stumbled into a nasty ruin far more dangerous than anyone expected, and Lapis looked at Lauren, guessing he thought their group was unlucky to be lost in these ruins. Roran was surprised by how accurate her guess was, and asked whether she could read minds. Lapis said Mr. Roran had it written all over his face, so he should be more careful with his expressions. She said it was probably not them who fared worst, but Mr. Ritz's competitors, and Roran reluctantly agreed, nodding as if to admit that might be true. Lapis told everyone to be quiet now that they had arrived and invited them inside. Lauren took in the scene and saw how simple everything looked. Lapis warned it was too early to celebrate because one important task remained. Pointing to the panel, she said there was a control console in front of them that could control the entire ruined structure. Roran asked if she could figure out how to use the device. Lapis nodded confidently and said she could handle it. At that moment, Chuck loudly said the doors had slid open. Confidently, Lapis said that everything was under her control and that she could be relied on, but froze when strange red symbols appeared on the display. According to her, the system did not accept the stop command, and the control function had to be activated for it to be executed. But there were no errors in the command structure, so the whole situation seemed especially strange. Roran asked her to explain why the command hadn't worked and whether it had been correct. Lapis admitted that had she known the exact cause, she would have fixed it long ago. She suggested the device may have become unstable over the centuries. If that's the reason, she will not be able to fix the device. Ritz was alarmed to see the entire screen covered in red symbols. Feeling threatened, Roran demanded to know exactly what was happening. At last, Lapis realized they were looking at a laboratory, so it must have office space for the staff, and Roran, though hesitant, admitted that was entirely possible. Lapis said everyone with access to the controls had to be registered in the lab's system, and Roran looked at her and asked her to explain what she meant. At that moment, Ritz shouted, pointing out that 2 doors had opened at once. Chuck replied, alarmed, that he didn't understand what was happening. Lapis said quietly that a biometric authentication error had occurred. At first, only researchers could access this object. Unregistered users like her could not issue stop commands. The red symbols meant the biometric check had failed. She had warned that if they ignored the messages and kept entering commands, the system would lock all controls after 3 failed attempts, and that is exactly what happened. So now they could do nothing. The system flagged them as violators and activated its internal interception protocol. This meant the object would now eliminate them as a threat. Ritz warned this was extremely dangerous and insisted on a clear plan. Rorn asked for a simpler explanation, because he still did not understand. Lapis said simply that the system saw them as intruders and planned to eliminate them with the help of goblins. The exit was already blocked, and this control room led directly to the room where the goblins were created. She was certain they'd burst in here at any moment, and they'd have to hold back the onslaught. Ritz growled in irritation but agreed. Lapis apologized and said she would try to trick the system. If she succeeded, the goblin threat would disappear. But while she worked, she would be completely defenseless. Ritz looked suspicious and asked why she even thought she could do it. Calmly, Lapis said she was a priestess of the god of knowledge and had reason to believe in her own strength, and Roar asked whether she really had an explanation for everything that was happening. Lapis said calmly that she had not told a single lie. Roran nodded, accepting that, and told her to keep working. He promised they would hold back the enemy attack. Lapis thanked them and said she relied on them completely. Nim said the goblins were already approaching. Ritz agreed they had no other choice. Ritz noted the door was not that wide. Ordering Nim to stay by the device and cover Lapis while she worked, he turned to Chuck and asked if he was ready. Chuck gritted his teeth and said he could handle it, even though everything happening infuriated him. Ritz looked at Roran and said it was his turn. Roran replied confidently that he was ready. They fought back against the incoming goblins, driving them off one by one. A black goblin then appeared, more dangerous than the others. Chuck told Colts to stay close to Lapis because Colts could no longer fight. Colts hung his head and apologized for being helpless. Lauren stared at the black goblin and said firmly that he would take him on. He fought on against the black goblin, pouring his last strength into every blow. Roran's sword was about to fall apart from the strain and the repeated impacts against the enemy's thick hide. It would not survive another serious clash. Calling to Lapis, he demanded loudly how much longer she would be working. Without looking up from the panel, Lapis said she would finish as quickly as possible, but warned this was more than fighting a system and that she was dealing with technology left by an ancient kingdom, so such a complex structure could not be solved in a couple of minutes. Despite everything, she expected to finish the operation within an hour. Nim warned they were almost out of arrows and they would not last that long. Colt admitted he had only 1 spell charge left, after which he would no longer be able to use magic. Chuck hit another goblin and shouted angrily that their numbers seemed endless. A growing unease settled in him as the creatures grew stronger with each wave, even outmatching those they had fought before. Even amid the fight, Roran saw goblins carrying their fallen kin off the battlefield. Roran felt disgust at the disturbing pattern. Lapis said fallen goblins were vital resources to them, and added that letting goblins take bodies was extremely dangerous, even for a few seconds, while Chuck, breathing heavily, admitted they'd have stopped it long ago if they could. Ritz confirmed they were doing their best to stop the enemy and hold their position. Rurin questioned whether it was really that important, but Lapis reminded him they had already discussed it. She explained that the goblins used their dead not as mere trophies, but as carriers of experience, with each fallen goblin holding combat data, tactics, defenses, maneuvers, and striking power, all of which was passed to new creations and drove their rapid evolution. The manual states that transferring the data to a new body took only a few seconds. She pointed out that the room they were in was directly connected to the center where new goblins were made. Roran said he now understood that the longer they fought, the stronger the goblins would become. Their enemies' efforts were aimed at turning the experience of the dead into strength for new fighters. Lapis said that after enough information was gathered, the system created a new, more advanced version of the Goblin, and these new enemies were much more dangerous than the previous ones. A Goblin blocked the arrow with his shield, making Chuck cry out, and he saw the Goblins were using their weapons differently, a worrying sign of their adaptation. Ritz urged everyone to hurry, alarm in his voice, before the next, even stronger enemy was created. Rorin reported at once that such an opponent had appeared. A new creature, unlike the others, stood before him, and he entered the fight. The battle grew fiercer. Roaring cursed inwardly when he realized how far superior this new Goblin was to the others. His skin was so thick that any attack barely left a mark. He roared and saw this Goblin smile, a mocking look that made him furious. Sensing mockery and weakness from his opponent, Rohan screamed inwardly that he would not allow himself to be judged, would not tolerate ridicule, and would not admit defeat. Rorin kept fighting despite his exhaustion and old weapons. The battle was merciless and grew more brutal with each passing moment. Chuck looked around and said the rumors about the mercenary were probably true. Rorin was fast becoming the legendary mercenary people had once only whispered about. Tired but firm, Nim warned against relaxing and urged Lauren to act like his rank demanded as the situation grew critical. The sword he fought with would soon fail, she warned. Soon Ritz looked at the panel and called to Lapis in alarm after noticing strange activity in the system. Lapis, without looking up from the console, said she had already entered the commands to shut down the facility and stop Goblin production and only needed to finish the process, but the system would not accept the final command. Outraged, Ritz demanded an explanation. Lapis said the problem was simple. The system would not shut down. If she could shut it down completely, the earlier commands would take effect, the ruined structure would collapse, and Goblin production would stop for good. Ritz shouted that if they could not stop the system from the console, they might as well physically destroy it, and Lapis replied in a heavy voice that if he could do it, he should not waste time, noting that the system was remarkably resilient, having run for hundreds of years without maintenance and still being in perfect condition. Destroying the mechanism physically would certainly work. Ritz moved in silently, told Lapis to step aside, and struck the device with all his strength. The outcome was disastrous. Ritz's sword shattered and left the device unharmed. He screamed in anger when he realized how strong the defense was. And Lapis said the system was protected by a magic spell, so normal physical attacks would not work. Only a special magical weapon could destroy it, and without that weapon, the device could not be broken. In that instant, Lauren's sword couldn't bear the strain and finally gave way. Rorin thought it over, replaying every word in his head. Lapis's words about the magical protective coating caught his attention. He sighed, realizing he had one more try. Ordering Lapis to step back from the console, he quickly pulled out the pendant that had once belonged to the Goblin mage and threw it into the device's core. Lapis suddenly realized the necklace in front of her had once belonged to that very Goblin magician. She recognized it as a mana drain necklace, an artifact that slowly absorbed magical energy and stored it to be released when needed. Lauren suddenly remembered that a lot of time had passed since they had the necklace after the Goblin lair, and it likely had gathered enough magical energy, so now was the best time to use it. A loud, powerful sound tore through the air like a discharge running through the whole structure, shaking the stone walls. Sensing the magical shift, Colts was surprised to learn the protective barrier had vanished. It no longer felt like it had dissolved into thin air. Scanning his surroundings, Chuck saw more goblins approaching and cursed at the endless stream of them. Rorin immediately threw his broken swords directly at the central part of the control system. A sharp burst of magic from the necklace he'd used before flowed into his attack. What had been protected was completely destroyed, the mechanisms inside sparking then freezing as a powerful energy pulse ran through the room. Suddenly, the goblins began collapsing one after another. Their bodies went limp and movement stopped. Those still approaching fell unconscious as if an invisible thread to life had snapped, and Ritz, watching, could only say that the goblins had stopped. Relief flashed through Lapis as she realized she could move and her body wasn't paralyzed, a good sign, and she figured the necklace probably held little mana, which explained why the effect radius was smaller last time. The result was enough to turn the tide of the battle. They had miraculously survived. She was amazed that Lauren had thought of that idea in such an extreme situation. Even Lauren was surprised, and admiration came with concern. Yelling at Lauren, she blamed him for how dangerous it was, then quickly grew alarmed when she saw he wasn't responding. Running closer, she found Lauren unconscious and collapsed on the floor. Nim saw something odd on the goblin's body and turned her wits. Later, Roran slowly opened his eyes and regained consciousness after the earlier events. Relieved, Lapis said she was very happy he had finally woken up, and that he thanked fate for returning to consciousness. Roran reacted with mild irritation, flicking Lapis on the head to show his displeasure and pointing out that she should not have been so reckless and spontaneous in mounting men without permission or reason. Lapis replied with some resentment that there were no accessible, comfortable places to sit where they were, aside from the choice she had made, and Roran, keeping calm, pointed out that she could still sit on an empty, suitable spot on the bed. Lapis complained with clear displeasure that the bed was so hard and uncomfortable her butt would fall off if she sat on it for long. Rowan then checked where they were and, judging by the surroundings, concluded they were in a hospital or medical facility. Lapis confirmed they were in a hospital, asked him to recall the last moment before he passed out, and offered to tell him what happened afterward. Rowan said the last thing he remembered was throwing a long sword directly at the device at the center of the conflict, and Lapis said with satisfaction that Rowan showed no signs of memory loss or cognitive impairment, and that his berserker episode had been much milder and less destructive than others had experienced in similar situations. Roran replied ironically, saying her words made it sound as if berserker states were both good and bad in nature, which in itself seemed odd. Lapis, slightly surprised, confirmed she thought it was obvious, and emphasized that what mattered more was what happened after he threw his long sword into the device. At the guild, the representative thanked the team for the report on the investigation and study of the ruins, and said he was glad the entire team had returned safe and sound from the dangerous site. Then he told the participants they could collect their well-deserved reward from the next administrator nearby. Reports confirmed the tokens the team brought back from the ruins showed no doubts about their authenticity, and belonged to the silver-ranked team members who had previously taken part in the quest. The guild representative said they already knew the other group's leader, and would organize another search of the ruins for any relics or lost artifacts, then promised the matter would be resolved and asked everyone not to worry because they would take personal charge. Outside, Ritz, a participant, said he had only heard the mysterious man's name once, and would much prefer to hear it from the man himself. Ritz said that after being asked to investigate the ruins, they could barely find a single treasure or notable artifact, and after paying all mission preparation costs and medical bills, their finances were dire, and they were practically broke. Nim emphasized the positive outcome, saying that despite everything, they were all alive and had returned safely, which she saw as the main achievement. The cults expressed sincere gratitude for the chance to meet two strangers who proved to be very useful allies in that situation. Chuck, reflecting on the events, admitted the man in the control room had proven to be exceptionally capable, and for a moment he even thought the rumored mercenary might really be standing in front of him. He remembered the stories saying the man had a body like the wind, and when that wind swept by, everything in its path was torn to pieces by terrifying force. Ritz figured it was the mercenary wind cutter, but was sure it couldn't be him, since someone that famous wouldn't be a regular bronze-ranked adventurer. Chuck pointed out that even if it wasn't him, it was hard to believe 2 or 3 other people could have done what they had seen at the same time, and he remembered the young man saying he had once been a mercenary, which had sparked Ritz's real interest. Ritz told Chuck that if he had that much free time to daydream, he should hurry his treatment and get back to work. Meanwhile, Lapis explained that when the device was destroyed, its protective magic lock was released, which triggered the cancel and sleep commands inside the relic and let all their effects take hold. Lapis concluded that the ruins had become completely useless and lost their original purpose, adding that the main device was destroyed because a necklace inside it caused the internal magic circles to scatter and lose power. No mage with the current level of magical knowledge and technology could restore or repair this device. As Lapis admitted, the reward for the task was meager, so Ritz and his comrades were dissatisfied with her group. Lapis realized about half of what she said was a joke and shouldn't be taken too seriously. Roran, however, said that since their research had turned up nothing useful, it wasn't surprising. He said the investigation had failed but was not entirely meaningless, since the team still received a fairly large reward in the end, and Lapis admitted she had done something she should never have done. Lauren wondered if he should apologize for what had happened, but Lapis was thinking there could be trouble if any strange or awkward connections formed between them, Ritz, and the other participants. Lapis said she had overheard plans to seal the deactivated ruins after a reconnaissance team went there for further study, and she thought the site was no longer fit for use, preferring caution to later regret. Roran calmly said everything was clear, then asked who had brought him here and where their current hospital was located. Lapis said quietly that she had carried him after he lost consciousness, because Ritz and the others, who had offered to help, were wounded too, and they were in a city called Cafe. Annoyed, Warren said he had caused a lot of trouble. Lapis tried to calm him and said it was not worth his trouble and not a serious problem. She added incidentally that their mission to eliminate the Goblins had failed. With 3 comrades missing, they had failed to destroy the Goblin nest, and had no proof they had defeated even one Goblin. All this made failure inevitable and natural. After that, Roran remembered and asked what happened to the bag of ears. Lapis said with regret that the bag had apparently been lost in the last battle. Roran reacted with annoyance, upset by how things were unfolding. Lapis remembered when Ritz, right after Rohan fainted, wanted to leave because it was still not certain the danger had passed. Because of that, she couldn't collect any materials from the Goblins' bodies to use as evidence later, and not wanting to be a burden, she abandoned the idea. Still disappointed, Roran said it was a shame. At least he got out alive. And despite all their efforts, they ended up with nothing. He admitted that although those guys were reckless, they were not inherently bad people, and added that Lapis was not that bad either. Lapis thanked him quietly and said she hoped the reconnaissance squad could still find and rescue the girls, since they had only faced ordinary goblins. As a result, the team had received no reward for their current request and had incurred expenses during the trip, and the girl said she had already used money from his wallet to pay for transportation, while the cost of treatment and hospital accommodation was a separate issue. She paid for everything herself, hoping Ron would repay her one day. Ron then asked how long he had been unconscious. Lapis said he had been away about 3 days, including the travel day, so adding treatment and 2 days lodging charged as one night came to about 5 silver coins. She told him not to worry and said he would only need to repay what he owed with no extra interest. Roran hesitated and admitted that even then he could not afford it. Lapis calmly explained she would not force him to pay it all at once, and offered to let him repay the debt in installments, while Efrauren, holding back his skepticism, noted the conditions sounded too good to be true. Lapis realized she had done it on purpose, courting him deliberately and spending almost all her resources so she had no money left. Lapis knew keeping him in her debt was cruel, but she did not care. At last, she said plainly that, in return for all the effort and resources spent, she wanted Roran to agree to travel with her. Lapis's thoughts settled on one important conclusion. If she traveled with this swordsman, they would meet the minimum party size needed to accept quests. In her view, such a partnership would be an effective way to keep intrusive, annoying fellow travelers she saw as parasites at a respectful distance, and it would give them a chance to prove themselves as a fully formed, effective group by showing their skills and fighting potential to others. She knew that despite her power as a member of the demonic race, traveling alone, especially posing as a priestess, brought real practical and social difficulties. She admitted that Roran, a powerful warrior who knew her origin, and that her race was hated, never changed how he treated her or how he looked at her. That showed his inner strength and proved he was reliable. And in her mind, he had already become not just a combat partner, but also a savior she felt deep gratitude toward. They decided now was not the time to discuss financial difficulties. Lapis supported their possible alliance, noting that traveling with the priestess would be very beneficial for Roran himself. She said the agreement was fair, balanced, and a good deal. Roran replied with slight resignation, admitting the situation left him no choice but to accept the offer given his current circumstances, and Lapis asked whether his words could be considered consent because it was important to her. Roar agreed but set one condition. Their union would last only until he paid off her debt, which had accumulated from his treatment, accommodation, and transportation costs. Lapis readily accepted his terms and promised everything would be exactly as he wanted, and she sincerely said she hoped they would have a productive and interesting collaboration. Roran, holding back, said he was counting on that too, but, a little embarrassed, reminded her that it would be nice if she finally stopped sitting on him. Lapis had another secret thought she kept to herself, and she admitted the request worked in her favor. While they searched the room for instructions and a manual, she slipped several valuables into her pocket so quietly and precisely that even a nearby professional thief would not have noticed. Most of the items she had taken were enchanted. She figured the medallion they held also came from that room. So money wasn't a problem for her right now. Still, she felt a little sorry for Lauren, since his debt to her would only grow from now on, and she planned to take advantage of that. Even so, Lapis really looked forward to the adventure ahead. In her heart, she vowed to stand by Roran and share his journey no matter how hard it got. Two men stood aside, talking about the alarming news. One, looking worried, said another village had been destroyed. The other, not surprised, clarified he meant a pioneer village in the north and added it was not new or unexpected. They concluded that everything happening was directly tied to expanding agricultural land and the ability to collect more taxes, a measure that benefits only the rich. They believe these same rich people are carrying out plans to seize new lands. They said that in this situation, peasants should be given at least minimal protection if sent to such dangerous places. One man said bleakly that in the end, even if the peasants were completely driven out, their homes destroyed and they themselves died, no one would care much. They agreed that money rules everything in this world. Roran watched their conversation and silently agreed. People never willingly give up money. Regardless of background, peasants, kings, aristocrats, mercenaries, and adventurers all seek material well-being. Rowan's sudden display of cash made Lapis react. Lapis looked at him in surprise and noted with a hint of mockery that he seemed to have been drinking since the morning. Knowing he had been in the hospital for 2 days, she understood his desire to drink, but doubted he could afford it. And Lauren, not hiding his fatigue, admitted his mercenary squad had been destroyed, so he had no choice but to become an adventurer. That first mission had been an unpleasant ordeal. Now it was over, and he didn't say if it had succeeded, but he noted he had a comrade. Lapis, holding back her scolding, warned that drinking on an empty stomach, especially after an illness, is very harmful and can cause problems, and Roran replied that he had no money, so talking about drinking was pointless. Still cheerful, Lapis said she would pay, then turned to the waitress and ordered an egg sandwich without mustard for herself and one with ham for Lauren. Rowan noticed that although Lapis served the deity of knowledge as a priestess, she was exceptionally intelligent, and he even thought she might be too intelligent to be only a spiritual servant. Lapis told the waitress to add everything to the bill, and Rowan paused to reconsider, aware she could wield both divine spells and demon magic, and that he had taken the job expecting a solid start for a newbie like him. It seemed more complicated than he had expected, and he could only sigh. When Rowan asked how much a ham sandwich cost, she told him. It was the same price as an egg sandwich, 5 copper coins. He sadly realized his debt to her was still growing. Lapis stayed optimistic and said that in that situation you cannot just sit around doing nothing. Roran realized he became an adventurer because of constant money troubles. After meeting Lapis, he accepted his first mission, ended up in the ruins of an ancient civilization, and nearly died. The battle was brutal, and though he survived, he was left with nothing. All the expenses fell on Lapis's shoulders, so he decided to work with her until he recovered every last coin. Lapis tasted the food and found it surprisingly good. At that moment, Rohan again wondered when he would finally be able to pay off his debts. Reaching for the food, he said he would try some too. Lapis politely invited him to begin, and reminded him that although they were going to work, Roran still had no weapon. He sighed and said the only jobs he could do without a sword were as simple as cleaning ditches, and Lapis protested and refused, since that work would leave a smell, and as his new partner, she did not want him to smell bad. She offered a remedy to remove the unpleasant smell and said that if he used it, she would not object to such tasks. Roran wondered whether she would later deduct the item's cost from his reward, and then he asked if she had any assignments he could take on in his current state. Lapis suggested postponing the tough topics and focusing on food for now, and Roran, with mild skepticism, said they were not that difficult. Roran inspired envy among them, since they saw how clever he was, Even as a copper-ranked adventurer, he had already found a woman to feed him, and they all dreamed of the same. Warren looked at their tokens and noticed they were iron rank, and Lapis, seeing him watching, told him not to react to their words. But Warren said that if such people are allowed to act with impunity even once, they will keep doing it. Lapis saw his stance as coming from mercenary principles, but she still thought it unwise to pounce on everyone who said something rude, and she felt those men were hardly worth paying attention to since they did not even have women who would do such things for them. The two heard her say those words aloud, and one of them reacted rudely, demanding to know exactly what she had said. Roaring's face tightened, showing he intended to fight. Seeing it had come to this, he resolved to fight them, and, if necessary, kill them. Lapis said killing anyone would be pointless because it would instantly make them criminals in the eyes of the law and the guild. She reminded them that 90% of misunderstandings between adventurers end in tragedy, urged everyone to avoid escalation, and insisted no one pick pockets because being caught stealing in public was the last thing they needed. Roaring replied to her remark with a brief call to hold back his anger. Lapis spoke more reservedly, saying that if a fight broke out, they would have to pay for damage to the establishment, and she calmly added that she would cover all costs and would pay for any destruction if Roaring decided to wreck everything. The two men watching them spoke rudely, and one said in a harsh, humiliating tone that he would only forgive them if she knelt before him because she was only a woman. They suggested she could be useful as a priestess in many ways. One of them said Roaring had already had his fun with her and declared it was their turn, making clear they were ready to be violent. Lapis felt indignant when she heard those words, calling them truly rude for saying such things in front of an innocent girl. Lapis admitted to herself that in the end it came down to her getting into a fight. Once things settled down a bit, Lapis suggested collecting medicinal herbs, saying it was a simple, accessible way to earn at least some money. Roaring backed the plan, saying the quest was to gather medicinal herbs in the forest near the city, that there were no dangerous monsters in the area, and it could be completed without weapons. Lapis clarified the guild pays 2 copper coins for each herb, and after doing the math, said Roaring must collect at least 705 plants to pay off the debt in full. Hearing this, Roaring asked them not to make his painful situation worse. Lapis said everything seemed simple, and Roaring asked why she started collecting herbs herself. Lapis said she hoped to make some money that way, since it would be a shame if she couldn't lend Roaring another loan someday. Then half-jokingly she chided him for relaxing too often and overlooking possible herbs. Roaring admitted he wasn't very good at it, and said that if it had been a battle, he would have paid off the whole debt long ago. Lapis pointed out he didn't even have a weapon. Roaring agreed and said he probably wouldn't be able to collect much. Lapis noted philosophically that nothing could be done because it was a common, often repeated request that always found someone, and suggested they go back, while Roaring agreed grudgingly, confirming it was time to return. Lapis reminded them the guild's recommended hotel price was 30 copper coins, food cost 5 to 7 copper coins, and a drink cost 2 copper coins, so minimum daily expenses were between 45 and 53 copper coins. Even after completing the current request, Roaring would still be in the red, so she offered to give him more money and buy the items needed to improve his situation. Roaring said aloud that in such a situation it was doubtful copper-ranked adventurers could survive, and he doubted they could manage it. Lapis answered honestly that most of them live in debt, act recklessly, take risky jobs for money, and a single mistake can cost them their lives. She believed the smartest move was to reach iron rank as soon as possible and join a strong, dependable team. Rowan decided the world they lived in was cruel. Financially, the mercenaries seemed to be doing fairly well, Rowan noted to himself. He said this was probably due to the commander's efforts and the accountant's competent work. Lapis said that whatever happened, one still had to live, and she asked whether she should carry her things. Roar stopped her abruptly and told her to be quiet because he heard someone nearby. Lapis then suggested they run away to avoid danger. Roar agreed the idea might be reasonable, but he felt a strange, unsettling premonition. He soon noticed the girl and called to her. Lapis was surprised that she had no idea how she'd ended up here. Lauren suggested she was probably just lost. Lapis studied her and saw the girl was barefoot, yet her feet were uninjured and her clothes were clean, so it was unlikely she had come on her own. She lacked developed muscles and had soft, uncalloused skin on her hands and feet. Signs she had been well cared for and likely came from a noble family. Roar looked around wearily when he saw the girl and noted that he did not like what was happening at all. Something about her presence felt strange and disturbing. Suddenly, Lapis saw movement in the trees and shouted that timber wolves were attacking them. Roran volunteered immediately to face the threat, saying he would personally deal with the wolves and free the girl, treating it as a matter of honor. Lapis did not object, but she oddly reminded him he had no weapon and that the battle would be much harder without one. Roran replied confidently that this would not be a problem. He said he could handle such opponents, whom he simply called dog, even without a sword. At his words, Lapis had a vague thought that he had actually called these predators dogs. After defeating the wolves, Roran asked with interest if their meat was edible. Lapis replied calmly that the meat was not fit to eat, but their skins could be sold for some money, and Roran said he did not have a knife, which would make that difficult. He showed regret, then looked at the still unconscious girl and asked how she felt. Lapis checked her and was relieved to find no visible wounds, concluding the baby appeared fine and noting they were lucky to find her before the wolves reached her, which had saved her life. Rowan agreed thoughtfully that life had to be balanced, so if someone was very unlucky, someone else had to be lucky like this girl. And Lapis, thinking the same way, added that by that logic, there must be someone extremely unlucky right now, and she wondered if they had anyone in mind who was having a particularly hard time. Roran asked a practical question about what they should do with the girl they'd found, and Lapis said they could not leave her alone under any circumstances. So reluctantly, Roran admitted he did not want to bring her into town, because it could create more complications and suspicions. Lapis offered a sensible plan. Once they got back to the city, they would hand the girl to the guild so the right people could take care of her. And Roran stepped forward and gently lifted her into his arms. Lapis noticed him move and asked what happened. Roran said nothing special had happened, only that the girl was unexpectedly light, even for a child. Lapis, a little surprised, saw she looked slightly plump and wondered who she could be given how she looked, yet weighed so little. Roran said in a quiet tone that maybe when the girl woke, she would explain everything herself. But he added that they would not want anyone to think they were kidnapping her, and Lapis playfully pointed out how it would look from the outside as two suspicious people taking an innocent girl away. Roran said irritably that she should at least not include him among the most suspicious villains, and in his mind he reviewed what had happened and realized that meeting the mysterious girl had launched their new adventure, one full of uncertainty and trials. Roran and Lapis entered the city calmly, meeting no resistance and drawing no suspicion from anyone around them. Lapis realized the situation would have been completely different if they had actually been criminals. Since then, it would have been much harder to pass through the gates, but with the priestess beside them, they could walk confidently and without fear. Roran said with admiration how wonderful it must be to be a priestess who commanded such respect. And Lapis added that in that role they enjoyed a level of credibility from others that ordinary travelers did not have. They arrived in Koffa City and went straight to the Avengers Guild, where a staff member was already waiting, and the guild representative looked at them and asked whether they had rescued the man in the forest, something she probably already knew. Roran confirmed it happened exactly like that and invited the girl to see for herself. The girl then said the guild would take responsibility for anything found and asked whether they objected to that decision. Roran said he had no objections because he did not intend to accompany the girl forever, and the guild representative asked to speak with them in the guest room about some matters. Roaring immediately clarified an important point. It was not a kidnapping. The guild representative said she understood, since sane kidnappers would not have brought the victim to the guild, and then added she wanted to discuss something else and moved straight to the point. Hesitating, she said the guild wants to place temporary restrictions on Roran and Lapis's movements. Roran reacted with surprise, clearly not expecting this. Lapis asked what this meant and whether the measures were linked to suspicions about them, and the guild representative quickly said there was no such thing and that no charges had been filed against them. She explained that the guild only wanted to confirm the girl's identity, and until the results came back, it would be unwise for Roran and Lapis to act on their own. and Lapis anxiously asked whether something had happened to the girl to prompt that approach. The guild representative said she couldn't give a definite answer right now. Rar asked what restrictions were being discussed and how long they would last. The interlocutor said that if they needed a time frame, it would be a few days and the first results should appear then. The guild asked that they not leave the city and, if possible, stay at a specific hotel. Roran said the conversation did nothing to make him feel calmer or more at ease. The guild representative said the hotel on the main street was called Monogotsvitya. Roran admitted the name meant nothing to him. Lapis noted that Monogotsvitya was competing for the city's top hotel title, was known for its high-class service, and was expensive. The guild representative said the guild would cover all living expenses and amenities, and if they needed anything extra, they could simply name the guild and it would be paid for. Roran doubted the guild really believed an adventurer could be bribed with such treatment, since treating him too well would breed mistrust. He added that no mercenary would accept a mission just for the promise of mountains of gold. Lapis thought they were supposed to pretend not to notice. Roran reminded them it went against Lapis's moral principles. Lapis confirmed he opposed that attitude. Roran pressed for details about the girl they had brought to the city, and Lapis refused to let their actions be restricted without an explanation, insisting on at least a brief account and worrying it might harm them. The guild representative said the chance of this happening was very low and explained that only a few people in the guild knew the girl, so they would have to wait until she woke up to clarify the situation, which could take several days. Lapis realized the guild wanted to confirm the girl's identity, and until it was proven that Roran and he were not involved, they would keep them close. He believed that once the guild was convinced they had only found the girl in the forest by accident, their suspicions would disappear, and until then they could stay at the inn at the guild's expense. Ron asked whether the guild would really take care of the inn and the money. The guild representative confirmed they would handle everything and asked if a double room was needed. Rowan said sharply, they needed separate rooms or there would be no agreement, demanded it be made clear, and Lapis agreed. Then he told the priestess he was personally against communal living. After a while, Rowan suggested the girl they found in the forest was probably not from the city, but came from far away and might belong to a noble family. Lapis said it was surprising she ended up alone in the middle of a forest with no villages or safe roads, and wanted to know what might have happened to her, adding that for now they could only enjoy the comforts of an expensive inn and wait patiently for the guild representatives to contact them. Then asked if she was tired. Satellite. Roran avoided a direct answer, saying he didn't like what was happening and his body felt wrong, like he couldn't even tense up, and he added it wasn't due to too much tension yet. His whole body felt sluggish and out of control. Lapis, hearing this, said that while Roran's mind had already returned to normal, his body was still recovering from the recent events. Roran briefly showed doubt, unsure whether to agree. 2 days later, a girl from the guild told them that because the guild had proven their innocence, all restrictions on their movements were lifted. She thanked them for cooperating and said they could go ahead as they wished. Surprised by the brief reply, Lapis said she was bewildered that they were not told exactly what had happened. The guild representative said the guild decided who got the information, and it was only given to selected venturers of iron rank or higher. Lapis countered, reminding them they had brought the girl to the guild and deserved an explanation regardless of the information, but Roran then stopped his companion and cut off her attempt to insist, and Lapis reacted with surprise. Roran explained his companions served the god of knowledge and naturally sought to learn even things usually hidden. The guild representative looked embarrassed, admitted she had heard of people obsessed with finding the truth, and reminded him the final decision belonged to the guild. Rowan calmly said he understood she couldn't tell him anything, so there was no point in insisting, and he asked whether the information had already been passed to those who needed it, and whether there was any way to find that out. The guild representative confirmed the guild had already identified a small circle of people who could be trusted with the information and had passed it on. Roran then said that if they were found innocent, they were free to leave and announced they would move out of the hotel today while Lapis tried to stop him, and the guild representative thanked him for his cooperation and formally ended the guild's involvement in the case. Lapis, clearly worried, asked exactly what he planned. Roran warned him not to pressure the girl, since she would keep the secret even when pushed, and if it suddenly slipped out, she would be in serious trouble. He said it was far more trouble to try talking to someone ordered to stay silent, so it made sense to turn to someone allowed to share information. And Lapis asked whether Roran knew exactly who to turn to. Roran said confidently that he knew the name and face of the person they needed, so they would find them quickly. Lapis grabbed Warren's hand, not hiding his excitement. Warren tried to object, but Lapis looked him in the eye and said she did not know where to go, so he would have to lead her himself. She told him not to hesitate and to move quickly. Roran walked into one of the city's establishments and questioned the locals, gathering the information he needed. After a while, Rowan turned to a familiar man, remarked he hadn't seen him in a long time, though not much time had passed, and suggested they sit down to continue the conversation. Chuck was surprised to see them and asked how they had found the place. Roran said they had to ask around to get here. Lapis explained it had cost them 30 coppers but was necessary, so she paid for it herself, then greeted Chuck and said she had not seen him in a long time. When Chuck recognized the others, he showed he understood and asked his sister to bring 2 more mugs of ale. Roran declined the offer but said he was still grateful. Chuck insisted, saying they had been a great help and he wanted to at least treat them to something to show his appreciation. Lapis admitted they hadn't really done much and that all their previous work had gone to waste. And Chuck retorted that they shouldn't talk nonsense, that the money was indeed lost, but that's how it happened. And the important thing was they were alive, which was good. Admitting he had been annoyed, he said it was in the past and not worth worrying. Then he proposed a toast to the meeting. Roran apologized, likely for the situation or for not being able to join the toast. Chuck said everything was fine, and he wasn't offended, noting they didn't seem to be here for small talk and asking why they had come to find him. Roran said they had found a girl in the woods a couple of days earlier and had taken her in. Surprised, Chuck found out it was them and remembered the guild had discussed the story only among members of iron rank or higher. That explained why they had come to him. Roran explained that his partner wanted at least some information about the girl. Chuck said he understood and reminded her he was a silver-ranked adventurer, and that no one should expect him to just go and tell her what he knew. He pointed out that mediocre adventurers who talk about their work rarely reach the silver rank. Roran admitted he hadn't expected that frankness. After talking with his partner, they decided Chuck was the one who could sell them that information. Chuck reminded them that Rohan had saved his life and offered a compromise, saying he would speak if they agreed not to reveal the source, and Rohan promised he would not cause any trouble for Chuck. Lapis confirmed she keeps her word and thanked him, calling him Sir. Chuck approved of their attitude, warned he could not vouch for the information's accuracy, and suggested they decide for themselves what to do with it. He then shared what he knew, saying the girl they'd brought was named Sina Lombartia and came from the city-state of Hanza. Roar heard the name Hanza and tried to process it. Lapis said the city-state of Hanza lay about 3 days' travel south of Kaffa. It was a small country whose capital had the same name. Senna meant nothing to Lapis, but Lombartia was the name of the ruling family. Roran was surprised by how much Lapis knew. Lapis chuckled warmly and asked if he wanted to compliment her too. Chuck continued, saying Senna was the only daughter of the ruling family, and that their position was not exactly brilliant, but he still felt being rude would be inappropriate. Roran wanted to know why they were held back when they first brought the girl in, and Chuck said the Gill had done it to keep them from revealing anything too soon. Finding a noble girl alone in the forest would draw instant attention and spark a wave of rumors. He added that people who help usually expect a reward, but in this case they would get nothing. First, no one had asked for help, and second, there was no one to confirm whether this girl was really Senna. Lapis assumed she could find out her identity in 2 days. Chuck said no one had reported anything to him, but he knew that the guild suspected that the girl was real, and the messenger sent to Hanza had not returned yet, so Roran said the messenger might not have arrived since it had only been 2 days. Lapis remembered that the organization's messengers usually carried magical devices to send their location, and suggested that contact with him had likely been cut off. Chuck added that the guild had decided Hanza wasn't a partner worth paying much attention to, but they did not want to anger him, so they gathered several groups of iron-ranked adventurers to send the girl back with them. The guild had already sent an official request for her return to Hanza. He said the fee was modest, so silver-ranked adventurers declined to take the job. Lauren said he did not think the information was particularly sensitive. Chuck agreed, but said this information was treated as internal and not usually shared, since the guild did not tell them everything just because they were copper-ranked adventurers. Lapis wondered what it would take to access that information, and Chuck doubted it, suggesting it might be more than a matter of rank. Lapis said with a small smile that her interest was simply ordinary human curiosity, since it was natural to wonder how a member of an aristocratic family who lived in abundance and seemed safe from trouble ended up all alone in a wild forest 3 days' journey from her home. She said it made sense to want to clear up every detail. Roran pointed out that at their bronze rank, guild leaders would not invite them to discuss those matters. Lapis suggested there might be a way around that limitation. They insisted they had never seen or encountered it and said it was impossible to do. Chuck, overhearing, said such a method did exist. Lapis wanted to know what the method was. Chuck said that in exceptional cases, when a silver-ranked adventurer gives an official recommendation, a copper-ranked adventurer may be temporarily considered an iron-ranked participant. If Ritz sends the request personally and includes a recommendation from Chuck and his comrades, Roran and Lapis could fully participate in the matter, and Lapis enthusiastically said it was a wonderful opportunity before Roran interrupted her. He needed to be sure Chuck was truly confident in the decision, because if it failed, both their and his reputation could suffer. Chuck said calmly. There would be no problem, added that Ritz would likely say the same, and stressed it was voluntary, so if Roran did not want to take part, no one would force him. But if he did, Chuck wanted him to get a good weapon first. Roran started making excuses, saying he needed to sort the weapons first and would then return to the proposal, asking Chuck for 1 day to try to settle the matter. Chuck laughed and said Roran was a real weakling acting like a henpecked husband, while Roran muttered that he knew everything perfectly well. Chuck decided that if Roran could come up with something in a day, they could return to the conversation, and he assured Roran that the Silver Adventurers would not join this mission and that their recommendation should cause no problems. Roran said he trusted him and went straight to Lapis to ask for money. Lapis, surprised, asked whether he planned to buy a weapon, perhaps a large sword. Roran replied that if so, he would not bother Chuck or the others. Adopting a businesslike tone, Lapis asked Chuck when the work would be sent. Chuck said he had no exact information, that the timing would depend on the girl's condition, and that he had heard it would be in about 3 days. Lapis understood what she had heard, apologized to Roran, and said she could lend him some money, but asked him to wait a little because she feared she might not have enough cash and would need to get more funds. Roran said he would handle the matter later, and because she needed time, he would wait. Lapis said she was ready to begin immediately. Chuck joked that Roran had no urgent business and could stay, since it was hard for them both as they had fallen for very unusual women, and Roran asked in a reserved tone what that assumption was based on. Chuck gave a slight wave and said he understood perfectly because he was in a similar situation, admitting Nim always pushed him around knowing how he felt. But after thinking it over, he decided being henpecked by that grumpy, flat-bottomed woman was not so bad. Even her bad temper had become part of her charm, and Roran grinned, knowing that if she heard that she would quickly turn him into a hedgehog. The next morning, Lapis walked into the room and was surprised to find they had spent the whole night there. Nim came up beside them and asked where Chuck was. Lapis greeted her and said it had been quite a while since they'd seen each other. Nim replied that it really hadn't been that long. Lapis apologized for completely forgetting to find a new place after they broke up, said she'd already rented a suitable place and moved all her things so there was no reason to worry, and added that Mr. Roran had little to move, so she handled the move quickly. Rowan thanked her, but wondered how she had gotten into his room in the first place. Lapis said she had claimed they were partners and was immediately let in, and Rowan thought it might be normal or that they were admitted because they represented the guild. Meanwhile, Nim turned to Chuck and woke him. Lapis noticed and asked whether Nim had come specifically for Chuck. Nim confirmed she had come for that, to take Chuck, the man she called worthless. Warren said they were simply sitting together and realized he'd spent most of his time listening to Chuck's love story. Nim turned to Lauren and said he was a good person, suggesting Lapis should follow his example. Lapis frowned and asked if that meant she was bad. Leaving the decision to her, Nim said there was no need to worry, and that she would tell Ritzchuk was just bragging to his less experienced comrades. She promised to pay for whatever was needed and said goodbye. As Roran watched her leave, he suggested they apologize later. Lapis, slightly embarrassed, reminded her she'd already said everything was fine and added she wanted to know whether she was really that bad. And Roran said he wouldn't judge and saw no need to discuss it. Lapis looked around and told Roran to go to the weapons shop, stressing they needed both weapons and armor because no adventurer can do their job without reliable gear, and Roran's equipment was in poor shape, the armor badly battered and due for replacement. Roran said in a slightly wistful tone that he'd been using his equipment since his mercenary days, and it had served him well ever since, and Lapis assured him they would find the right equipment for him and asked him to trust her completely. In the weapons shop, Lapis took charge and reminded Roran that his specialty was offensive actions. She thought he should choose armor stronger and more reliable than plain leather, and immediately pointed to one of the items I had recommended for purchase, and Roaring glanced at the item and was surprised to see it did not look like armor at all. Lapis revealed it looked like an ordinary cloak but was actually a magical artifact made from fabric, woven from a black widow's web, giving it exceptional strength and unique properties. The item had protection and self-recovery enchantments, and cost only 5 gold coins, 10 times cheaper than its actual market price. And Lapis said wearing the cloak over standard leather armor would greatly increase protection, and confidently concluded they should buy it. Rorant reacted incredulously, asking whether the item really was worth 10 times more, whether that was an exaggeration, and whether the shop assistant had said so, and Lapis explained that the main problem was that the shop assistants themselves often did not know the true value of some items. She said the owner might not even know the item's value, and even if they discover it later, the important thing is to buy it before anyone raises the price, since the price tag is still there. Lapis kept talking until she saw an item she'd noticed earlier was gone, so she asked the shop owner where it had gone, assuming someone had already bought it. The store owner quickly dismissed her, saying no one had bought the item yet, and because it was too large for the sales floor, he moved it to the back room, leaving Lapis slightly surprised that he could do that. Waving his hand oddly, the owner admitted that several people had helped because one person could not have handled the task, and when Lapis heard this, she offered to pull the object back, but the owner stopped her, warning that the equipment was difficult to handle and the process would take time. Roran noticed that despite the store's modest size, it had a good selection of items. He thought that once he had some extra money, he might consider buying an auxiliary weapon, though he did not know when that chance would arise, and his eyes settled on a long sword that looked quite good. At that moment, a man walked into the room with a confident gait, drawing everyone's attention. Entering the store, he called sharply to Roran and demanded he take his hands off the sword, because he had long wanted that weapon. Arrogantly, the man admitted Roran had an eye for quality, but said such a weapon was not fit for a big, simple-minded man. He told Roran to learn his fighting skills before trying to use it and then said he would take the sword for himself. The shop owner politely thanked him for his patronage and for visiting. Meanwhile, Roran, admitting to himself that he couldn't afford it anyway, wondered who was standing in front of him. Seeing he was sullen, Lapis came over and asked if anything was wrong. Roran waved her off and said everything was fine. Lapis then noticed the long sword that had been on display was gone and assumed it had already been bought. Although the sword was fine, she had already prepared something much more suitable for him. Holding out another, she said it was impressive but still far inferior to the one she had chosen for Lauren. Roran was surprised. Seeing the sword, he marveled that Lapis had found such a rare weapon fit for the greatest adventurers. Lapis calmly listed the expenses, noting the new leather armor cost 50 silver coins, the magic coat 5 gold coins, and the sword 15 gold coins, with potions, a spare dagger, and other useful items also bought, bringing the total debt to 23 gold coins and 80 silver coins. Lauren felt relieved that Lapis had forgiven him for the bronze coin, which was already good, and joked that now, in addition to his equipment and possessions, he himself was slowly becoming her property. Lapis said an adventurer's equipment always belonged to the adventurer, so they need not worry, and reminded them they had a new request tomorrow, so they should get a good night's rest tonight. She said good night. Lauren showed her to her room, slightly annoyed. Lapis said she should have booked a double room and that she shouldn't have followed Lauren's suggestion. He replied dryly that she shouldn't start talking about being afraid and told her to go to bed. As Lauren lay awake that night, he realized this would be his second mission as an adventurer and was sure the request would draw many experienced fighters. They might not match Ritz's group, but there would be some iron rank adventurers among them. He hoped the team would be good. The next morning at the Adventurers Guild, one of the girls asked Lauren to come to the main hall to confirm his participation and register. In the hall, he immediately spotted the arrogant man from the gun store the day before. Recognizing Roran, he called out indignantly, calling him yesterday's idiot. Roar noted to himself at that moment that his hopes for a calm and professional team seemed to have been destroyed. Sarcastically, he said iron-ranked adventurers had become worthless because they would take anyone, then glanced at the bronze pendant on Roran's neck and said he was surprised since the request was meant for participants ranked at least iron. A nearby guild member calmly explained that Ron and Lapis had an official recommendation from a silver-ranked adventurer, and the man couldn't hide his surprise. The guild member added that under the guild rules, such a recommendation would upgrade a copper rank to iron, so Rowan and Lapis had every legal right to participate in the request. Roran, still thinking, figured the man would hardly claim to have connections, but the man still said, as before, that Roran should know his place. Admitting he did not understand how he'd gotten so lucky, he advised him to be careful and avoid disturbing others. Roran agreed calmly, promising to stay out of the way and not interfere. The other man looked puzzled, having expected more. A guild member stepped in and told everyone to stay calm, reminding them the task needed teamwork, but the man was outraged at being compared to someone like Lauren. A representative stepped in and said the least he could do was not interfere, warning that if he interfered with the request, the guild would fine him. She also reminded them that the guild had no problem with Roran and Lapis participating, since silver-ranked adventurers had confirmed their abilities. They would be punished if they were an obstacle. If Frank mattered that much, the opinion of a silver rank should matter to him. Roran calmly confirmed he understood when the guild representative said the request was an exception and warned him not to cause trouble, and he reiterated that he accepted responsibility. The representative looked at him and said that at first she thought he was just well-connected, but now she believed he truly deserved the title Iron-Ranked Adventure. Smiling, she announced the briefing would start shortly, but first needed to confirm everyone was present. Roran turned to Lapis, surprised she had been silent the whole time. Hayakam Lapis gave a slight grin and said arguing with such people was a waste of time, so she stuck to her own style. Roran briefly agreed. The representative announced a total of 23 participants. After thanking everyone for their participation, she announced the request was an official assignment from the Adventurers Guild to escort a girl named Senna Lombardia to the city-state of Hanza. The representative officially announced that the girl Sina is the daughter of the ruler of the city-state of Hanza, and said everyone involved in the request must treat her with proper respect and reverence. The guild planned ahead for the 3-day trip to Hanza and organized horse-drawn carriages to ensure speed and safety. The escort's main task was to provide protection along the way. After that, she said the guild had sent messengers to warn Hans as they approached the scene, but none returned or made contact. Because of that, special instructions called for extreme caution on the route. With higher risk, the guild set payment at 12 silver coins per quest participant, and one adventurer said that was too low given the danger. The representative replied calmly that the threat level had not yet been officially confirmed, so the amount was provisional, and she assured that if the actual danger proved higher, the reward would be reviewed and increased. Participants need not worry about payment. It will match the level of risk. Roran noted that although the adventurers sent earlier had not returned, the guild still gave no guarantees, and they might have to provide proof to get the extra bonus. He said the conditions were very difficult and unfavorable. The guild representative continued the briefing and reminded everyone that the current request was an official guild order. Participants were told they can refuse, but doing so will incur a fine. If the task is completed successfully, everyone will get the promised reward plus special privileges from the guild. She urged that the assignment be handled seriously and with full responsibility. Sina, visibly agitated, stepped forward and pleaded with the escorts to take her home. Admitting she could not make any promises right now, she said she would tell her father about what happened and ask him to reward the escorts, then bowed low to show sincere gratitude and hope. Lapis immediately asked for the contract. Roran thought the mission was extremely risky, but because he had been sent here on a personal recommendation, he no longer had the chance to refuse. The next morning, departure day arrived, and Lauren was surprised to see they would also be traveling in carriages. Lapis said they couldn't have made it on foot in 3 days, and she had never been on an escort mission before. Amazed that the guild had arranged horse carriages in a single day, she called it a display of strong administrative power and admired Lauren's fitness and how easily he carried his heavy sword. Warren said he'd long since gotten used to the weapon's weight. Lapis reminded him he carried a lot of other gear. Warren agreed and asked about the general layout for placement. Lapis said there were 3 carriages in all, since 23 adventurers had joined the mission. The first held 8 fighters, the second held Sina and 7 adventurers, and the third, the one she and Ron rode in, held the remaining 8. The guild's dispatch officer shouted for everyone to board quickly since there was already a delay. Roran agreed without arguing. He realized his weight might be too much for the cart. The coachman saw the cart leaning and shouted that it was overloaded on one side and he could not drive it in that condition. Lapis studied the situation and said there was nothing to be done. They would have to move from here to the other side. One of the adventurers bristled, unhappy about having to squeeze together. Bowing, Roran apologized and admitted he had nothing to say in his defense. Several adventurers remained calm. When they saw he could do nothing about it, one offered to help move the luggage, and another admitted his gear was too heavy, so he helped too. Their actions leveled the carriage. Warren thanked everyone sincerely. A fighter said they are all on the same team and should help each other as much as possible. This is the basis of teamwork. Roran was surprised to see that there really were good people among them. The brief calm did not last long. Several hours into the journey, Roran noticed something alarming and turned to Lapis to ask what was happening. After examining the scene, Lapis grimly concluded she could not make a precise diagnosis but was sure the person before them was dead. What had seemed like a simple escort mission became an ominous, frightening event filled with heavy foreboding. Roran felt a heavy, unsettling question inside about why this had happened and why it had unfolded this way, and his memories went back a few hours to when the events were just starting. Roran apologized for the inconvenience and hoped his apology would smooth things over. One of the men nearby turned to him sharply, angry that Rohan could not get comfortable in the carriage and was upsetting the others. His voice was irritated and he did not hold back as he accused Rohan of deliberately sabotaging them. Roran sighed inwardly, realizing he was in an unpleasant situation again, and irritated that the man was picking on him, and he was about to respond when another adventurer cut him off and rudely ordered him to shut up. The guild had already explained everything and ordered him back to his carriage without further discussion. Roran noticed that the guy, surrounded only by girls, looked like a typical popular type, fashionable and in demand. Lapis thanked a participant for helping her and called him Bros. Roran repeated the name to himself. Bros, clearly displeased, said he simply did not like people who talk too much. Roran was surprised that Lapis already knew his name. Lapis quickly explained that the guild had given a list of all quest participants ahead of time and that she had memorized every name. She added that Rose was an iron-ranked adventurer with 20 years of field experience. Bros asked in a sarcastic tone if she was trying to hurt him. Lapis stayed polite, assured him she had no such intention, and emphasized that among many adventurers only a few managed to reach the silver rank. With a 20-year career and no serious injuries, Bro's skill and experience deserved deep respect. After finishing her speech, she smiled and asked if he felt embarrassed by her praise. Bro said irritably that she was too loud and suggested she sit more quietly. The guild representative ordered the coachman to prepare to depart. One of the coachmen announced loudly that they had a 3-day journey to Hanza. The adventurers exchanged a brief wish of good luck, and the party set off. As the sun set, Roran noticed the growing darkness, and Bro said it would be dangerous to continue in the dark, so they would need to find a place to camp soon. The cart ahead suddenly stopped, and Bros doubted it was an ambush because nothing about it looked like an attack, so he suggested a technical problem with the cart. Spotting a tense, strange atmosphere up ahead, Lauren moved closer to find out what was happening. He went up to the coachman to find out what was happening. At first, the coachman said everything was fine, but then admitted feeling very nauseous and having internal discomfort. Roran asked worriedly if the passengers in the carriage were all right. The driver assured him they should be fine. Brothers stepped forward and called to Roran to ask what was happening. Roran said the coachman had become ill. Alert, brothers faced the coachman and demanded an explanation. A voice called for help. It also said not to forget to lay out the mats before setting up camp. Roran, still unsure what was happening, asked the people in the carriage if they were all right. He called for someone to answer, and when no clear reply came, he began to open the door to check for himself. Roran called to Lapis, his voice sharp as he urged her to come over immediately. Lapis reached the scene and began to examine it at once. Seeing the victim's irregular pulses and labored, ragged breathing, she decided they had to be removed from the wagon immediately or their condition could worsen. Lapis said Ms. Senna is simply in a deep sleep with no signs of declining health. Kraz cut in sharply, demanded an explanation, accused Rohan of holding up the group's progress, and pressed for an immediate answer. Roran kept his focus, apologized briefly and firmly, said he had no time to talk, and told Crassus to get the camp ready, then called to Brossus for help, leaving Crassus confused and wondering what was going on. As the bros approached, try to understand the cause of the panic. Crass, in response, rudely waved him away. After confirming whether the priest had medical training, Bros turned his gaze to Lapis and Roran immediately confirmed the question was serious. Lapis gave a preliminary medical assessment. She said one of the men suddenly lost strength and began having trouble breathing, with no signs of illness or visible injuries. The symptoms showed an unusual exhaustion that ordinary fatigue could not explain, and Lapis bitterly admitted she could not determine the exact cause of death for the two victims. Their heartbeat and breathing stop at the same time with no prior signs of illness or external injury. Essentially, they simply die for no apparent reason. The adventurers reacted with indignation and refused to believe the bodies were really dead. That morning, everyone had been perfectly fine, and the dead had been riding in the carriage like the others. Seeing the reaction, Bros could not contain his anger and loudly voiced his confusion about what was happening. Lapis stayed calm and suggested Bros verify her words himself. Bros walked over to the bodies, checked one, and confirmed the man was dead. Lapis nodded that both were terminally dead, and Roran watched and decided to act with extreme caution. Lapis immediately recommended burning the bodies. Bros was surprised and didn't understand why they couldn't just bury them. She explained burial wasn't an acceptable option under the circumstances. If the participants are firmly opposed to cremation, she says the only option may be to return immediately to the city of Kaffa. Rose wanted to know why those extreme measures were necessary. Lapis explained that the dead would likely become undead soon. Roran heard this and said in a shocked voice that it was impossible, because becoming undead usually required necromancy or an imposed curse. Lapis explained that sometimes the dead become undead not because of outside forces, but because they remain attached to a past life, and said the focus should now be on how to properly dispose of the bodies rather than on what caused their deaths. If any participants doubted her words, she suggested they consult another priest and pointed to a group of adventurers including Cross, the knight Layla, the mage Angie, and Loreu, a priestess of the water god. Lapis admitted she doesn't know all of Laura's abilities, but Laura's appearance alone shows she is a true priest who can speak on the matter. Calmly, Crass told Lapis she could do as she pleased, but not to interfere with their group. Loru calmly reminded them that priests are obliged to escort human souls, and have no right to leave them without a ritual, then turned to her water god and asked him to reveal the path and open the way for the dead. Lauren studied her and thought she truly looked like a priest. Lapis, grinning, asked whether she herself looked like a priest. Bros ignored the remark and asked what her conclusions were. Luru examined the bodies and said they were desecrated and would soon become undead. Roran was shocked and alarmed by how serious it was. Bros looked at those gathered and said grimly the situation was dire and could no longer be changed. He proposed they set up camp before dark and then begin cremating the bodies. Roran took the initiative, asked for help to move the bodies aside, and reminded them these were the comrades and friends of the dead. So, out of respect for their memory, they should perform this last duty. Later, one of the adventurers, barely holding back his emotions, said the situation was incomprehensible. Stressing there had been no battle and no injuries, so he could not understand why their comrades had suddenly become undead. He was confident the cause was the carriage itself, since the deceased rode in the second carriage supplied by the guild. The adventurer said Sina was the only one who felt fine after the carriage ride, and everyone else had problems. Tension rose, and Lapis looked around carefully and said firmly that staying here was becoming truly dangerous. Several adventurers could not hide their fear as they looked toward the Sin. Their voices shook with anxiety and doubt. They said they were truly terrified and warned each other not to look at her because her gaze seemed frightening and sinister. Lapis heard that and calmly, confidently said everyone could do as they wished, and Lauren, a bit hesitant, asked Lapis to confirm she was sure. Lapis looked at him warmly and said she had no reason to stop him or interfere, and that her only true wish was to stay by his side and share his adventures. She hoped he would one day confess the same to her. According to Lapis, she never tried to hold back his initiative or interfere with what he considers right, and now she asks him to keep following his own choice. Roran relaxed on hearing this, realizing he could no longer go back and that, in a way, it wasn't even worth it. He smiled slightly, turned to Senna, and said hello. To be friendly, he invited her to join them for a meal. He noted that food always tasted worse when eaten alone. Looking down a little embarrassed, Sina refused and said she had no appetite. Roran quickly apologized, careful not to hurt her feelings, and gently urged her to eat at least a little since they had another tough day ahead and would need strength. Senna nodded and agreed, but with worry in her voice she asked if her presence would be a burden to them. Rowan tried to calm her, saying there was no need to worry because his friend had already given full consent and had no objections. Sina relaxed a little and thanked them, saying she would move over a bit to keep them company. At that point, Krasis cut in with a sarcastic tone and guessed how Roran had gotten close to the silver-ranked adventurer, hinting at sycophancy. He said this behavior was expected from people seeking a good recommendation or trying to curry favor for an extra reward, mockingly adding that everyone could see why Roran was doing it. Roran cursed silently, realizing he was once again forced to endure Krasis's nagging. No matter how often he tried to reason, nothing changed. Irritation rose in him and he wanted to throw something heavy at Cross to stop the senseless malice. And Cross's insults didn't matter, but he wouldn't let Senna hear a single harsh word. Praxis insisted there was no reason for Roran to come any closer. Roran cut him off, calmly covering Sina's eyes with his hand, and then went to fetch logs for the fire to distract from the situation. Lapis, clearly irritated, seized the initiative and threw a log at Cross to cut him off, and Rowan inwardly noted that the blow had landed right on his head. Layla, Cross's friend and comrade, faced them with indignation, not understanding what was happening or why this was necessary. Roran twirled a Lapis with a half-smile and asked to look at her now. Lapis answered affirmatively and confidently, saying everything was fine and there was nothing to worry about. Speaking firmly, she told Lauren not to delay and to bring Miss Senna to them immediately. Bros, the group's organizer, gave a brief report to the gathered adventurers, saying a general council had met and agreed to keep moving toward the city of Hanza with the same group instead of returning to Kaffa. The adventurers murmured, and one spoke calmly that he had known the risk all along, was now getting what he had prepared for, and that those already dead would get no reward. He has no objection to continuing the mission, but he made it clear he will not ride next to a girl named Sina. Brow admitted with mild irritation that it was a problem, and Roran, watching, said he could understand the reaction even though he did not welcome it, so Lapis suggested an alternative, and proposed that she and Roran ride in the carriage with Sina. She said the previous night had been peaceful, that she and Roran had deliberately stayed beside Sinus' tent, so Sinus would not feel lonely, and had remained by her side the entire time, and Lapis confirmed they had spent a good deal of time together with Roran, showing no signs of illness. Roran confirmed he felt perfectly fine. Bros, hearing that, asked if they could ride with her in the carriage. Roran said they had spent the whole night together, and if anything was wrong with her, it would have already shown up. Brothers thanked them for the decision and said it would be a valuable service to the whole group, since leaving a client unaccompanied is highly undesirable. He asked if the spare carriages could hold the rest of the adventurers, but said no one would agree to ride in the dark carriage after recent events. He told them to report any change in condition or any incident immediately, stressing that if they ran into trouble, it would not make things easier for the others. Lapis was the first to greet Senna. Senna met their gaze and spoke with controlled warmth, calling them brother and sister. Roran stepped forward and offered to go with her. He turned to the coachman and asked if he was all right. The coachman hesitated, then said he was all right. Rowan realized the driver still looked unwell, and even on the second day of travel, many problems had already come up. Most of the adventurers were demoralized, and he feared something serious was coming. Bros ordered everyone to take their places, then turned to Rorn and Lapis and sternly warned them to stay on guard and remain highly vigilant from now on. In a slightly worried voice, Sina sought reassurance and asked if everything would be okay. Lapis assured her that everything would be fine because their group had a very strong mercenary. Roran asked in surprise if that was him. Lapis grinned and said it was him, since no other gentleman in their squad was called the Wind Cutter. Rorin looked a bit embarrassed and said there was no need to fool himself, since he was not the man with that nickname. People often mistook him for that man, but he had no nickname, and Lapis asked with interest if he knew the real Wind Cutter. Roran said quietly that he did not know the man personally, because anyone who met him on the battlefield never survived. He always made sure to avoid fighting him. Lapis asked with a hint of mockery if Roran was often called slow-witted, and Roran admitted it honestly, so Lapis nodded and calmly concluded that he was probably slow-witted. After a few more hours, Lapis grew bored and noticed that nothing interesting had happened in all that time. The driver said they would soon look for a place to stop and rest. Lauren, watching the road, thought to himself how quickly time had flown. The coachman spoke up when he saw someone standing on the road ahead and assumed they were ordinary travelers. Rowan offered to come and check the situation. Bros followed and explained what had happened. Rowan saw people standing in the middle of the road blocking the way, but their behavior and appearance seemed odd. Looking closer, Roran saw they seemed like ordinary townspeople at first. Something about them was alarming, and he realized there should be no villages or towns in this area. An adventurer, angry at the delay, loudly addressed the bystanders, demanded they clear the way, and reminded them their actions were hindering progress. Seeing what was happening, Lauren grew alarmed and warned everyone that something was clearly wrong with these people, and he asked them to be especially careful. At that moment, something irreversible happened. One of the people standing on the road suddenly bit the adventurer. The road erupted into chaos, and the adventurers scrambled to respond. One of them shouted, ordering the attacker to release their comrade. Panic spread. No one could understand why someone who looked ordinary clung with such force and anger. Rose immediately pitched in to help free the bit-in man, but he still had to put in a fair amount of effort, staring at the scene in confusion, admitting something was wrong with these people, and beginning to doubt whether they were really alive. Luru, the god of water's servant, said clearly and confidently that the ones before them were undead. Rose stepped back in shock and wonder. Seeing daylight and a bright sun, he knew this should not be happening. He ordered everyone into fighting positions. Brimming with confidence, Crassy said zombies were no match for him. Lila stood nearby and quickly warned him not to go too far ahead. Angie, reserved and calculating, reminded him her magic was limited and asked whether Kraz was sure he would not need help. Bros nodded, let him go, but also told Lore that Kras might still need treatment. Pras concentrated, deciding he needed to cut off the attacker's limb as quickly as possible, noting it was odd to fight people who looked normal, but reminding himself these creatures were no longer human, then struck with cold determination and finished the attack with a short phrase. Meanwhile, Layla noticed the enemies were acting differently, not ordinary zombies, and LaRue agreed they were most likely Revenants. Lapis held a sword, turned to Roran, and invited him to join the fight because she had brought his weapon. Roran surveyed the scene and said everything seemed under control, so his help was not needed right now. Lapis tried to lift the sword, complained it was too heavy, and admitted only Roran could carry it. Roran looked at her and said there was no need to worry so much, and that he did not need to join the battle right now. Watching Cross, he decided that help would only slow him, a clear sign of an iron-ranked adventurer. He then asked about Revenants and what was known about them. Lapis said a Revenant is a more dangerous undead than a zombie or an ordinary human. The name comes from the word returned. They arise for the same reasons as zombies, because of attachment to the living world, either by the will of a higher undead or through living magic. These creatures are more dangerous than zombies, but not stronger than a living person, and as the body decays, their power fades. Yet if a revenant is empowered by a higher undead or aided by magic, it can keep what remains of its mind and even exceed the abilities it had in life. A brief summary said, Revenants are more dangerous than zombies, and can seriously threaten iron-ranked adventurers if they outnumber them. Lauren was amazed by what he had heard, and realized that if it were true, it was hard to see how more than a dozen of those creatures could have appeared here in the middle of the road, since there were no cemeteries or signs of a battle nearby. He thought there might be more powerful undead nearby. The situation with them was as confusing and complicated as with living people. The only greater undead he could think of were vampires. The Revenants weren't the main worry at first. Bros asked what he meant. Lauren said he'd seen one of the creatures bite an adventurer. Rose said the bite wasn't deep because of his protective gear, but fragments of teeth were still stuck in his hand. He added there was one last enemy left. Crass looked at him and rushed forward easily. Bros watching this reacted with amazement and asked what had just happened. When the fight ended, Press said calmly that it was all over. Angie asked him again, indignantly, what he meant by those words. Layla, irritated, said Kraz was showing off again. Angie, to herself, called him a complete idiot. Layla reminded him she had asked him not to use that skill for trifles, especially without permission. Praz rejected their reproaches, saying he saw nothing wrong with it, while Luru, trying to restrain him, warned that they did not know who might be watching and that they should not reveal their abilities unless necessary. Angie called him a fool again and reminded him he had won without it. Crass wanted to say something, but kept quiet. Bros, confused, asked aloud why Cressus had suddenly lit up and vanished like lightning, adding that he couldn't help but notice, and Roar admitted he had noticed too. He realized that if this had been his first time facing such an attack, he probably would not have been able to parry it, because Cross's speed was astonishing, and the blow's force could have cut the Revenant in half. Roran wondered aloud again what it was. Lapis understood and turned to Bros. Bros asked if she knew what the ability was. Lapis nodded and explained that as a servant of the god of knowledge, she knew it was most likely a technique called reinforcement. Bros asked whether it was magic. Lapis explained enhancement was like support magic, but not the same. Support magic temporarily increased abilities. Enhancement was an innate gift that improved the user and any objects or creatures it was applied to. Bros admitted it sounded very convenient. Lapis said it was an extremely rare gift, and people who had it often became what others called brave and heroic. Roar thought about the difference between a brave man and a hero. Lapis concluded that Crass was likely linked to the Adventurers Guild and possibly overseen by government agencies. Roar kept it to himself and added that the gift was perfect for a smug dandy, and that he did not care, because once the job was finished, they would most likely never cross paths again. Surprised, Lapis asked what he planned to do. Roran, looking calmly ahead, said nothing drastic would happen yet, but they had to deal with the bodies. Leaving them like that, he added, would be barbaric. Lapis agreed, admitting Roran was right. Tension rose among the adventurers and turned to panic. One of them spoke for many, arguing it was time to turn back to Kaffa since the mission was acting strangely. People were dying for no reason. Undead were attacking in broad daylight as if appearing at the snap of a finger, and the whole area felt deeply wrong. It seemed the task had become too strange, which likely explained the disappearance of the envoys from the previous guilds. Rather than run, he suggested returning to the guild to reconvene and reconsider. He reminded them that everyone had earlier agreed to continue the task. Another adventurer replied that the decision had been made before those returnees arrived, and now the situation had changed, so fines for refusing the mission seemed less important than the real threat. With pain in his voice, he recalled how many comrades they had already lost and wondered whether anyone would compensate them for those losses. Bros, trying to keep order, told everyone to calm down and reminded them that they had voluntarily agreed to take part in this dangerous business and understood the possible consequences. He said they are currently much closer to Hanza than to Takafa, so it makes more sense to move forward, and he promised they will receive the reward on arrival, while anyone who still objects can request a second discussion and another vote. One of the adventurers said he had no intention of retreating and had not joined the group to return empty-handed, or to become fodder for the rebels. Admitting the mission had been the most terrifying of his life, he said he would now receive a large reward, including payments for those already dead, and someone replied that brave words mean nothing if a person is injured. His retort was that his left arm was fine and he was still in the ranks, and another participant said he would not go back either, not for the reward but to make sure his friends' deaths were not in vain. Bros summed it up and said they would keep moving if there were no more objections, and Roron, lost in thought, voiced his worries about the rebels' origins, noting he had searched their belongings before burial and found nothing that could point to where they came from. They only carried ordinary wallets, plain accessories, and other small items typical of everyday people. Bros, hearing this, concluded that these creatures were likely ordinary residents of a nearby settlement before they became undead. Roran agreed, but pointed out there were no nearby villages or towns they could have come from, and without knowing where the creatures came from, it was impossible to choose a safe route, so he recommended proceeding with extreme caution. An adventurer turned to Crassus and praised him, admitting he now saw him in a new light after he handled the undead in an instant, and his presence reassured the party. Roran thought to himself sarcastically that he was looking at a typical idiot. Browse got the group's attention and asked if anyone had objections. When no one answered, he ordered them to move on, reminded them they had only 1 day left before reaching the city of Hanza, and told everyone to stay on guard. He was surprised to realize he was already acting as the mission's leader. Roran grinned slightly and said it was a bit late for such revelations. Lapis, noticing his effort, thanked him for his hard work. He apologized to the coachman for the delay. The coachman replied calmly that everything was fine. Rowan realized that if he had known in advance what he would have to go through, he might have seriously considered returning to Kaffa. One of the adventurers suddenly screamed and froze in shock, refusing to believe what was happening. He screamed that he didn't want to become food for these creatures, and his voice broke as the Revenants attacked and tore him apart. The second night in camp began. Roran studied the situation and said it was more than just a matter of caution. The problem was too many enemies. Revenants attacked the camp again, and Crassus, caught in the thick of the fighting, said there were too many and he could not handle them alone. Roran turned to Lapis and asked if all the enemies were rebels. After carefully examining the battlefield, Lapis said most were zombies. Roran nodded, told the others to stay back, and stepped forward, while Sina, afraid, called his name, and Lapis quickly reassured her that he would be fine. Roran raised his huge sword and, with tired irony, could hardly believe the blade would cut through rotting flesh. Tightening his grip, he crushed the zombies with force and precision and cut a path through the second night's darkness. Feeling the sword's weight become part of him, Lauren looked at the weapon with genuine admiration and admitted it was a damn magnificent sword, as if it had been made just for him. Rose watched how easily he handled the huge blade and could not hide his surprise. He said, amazed at how easily Lauren swung the massive metal weapon. Lauren brushed off the praise and said one could get used to it. He then asked about Rose's condition, worried he might have been injured. Gathering his courage, Rose said he was fine and immediately steered the conversation toward something more urgent, wondering what they would do next, because the undead had appeared out of nowhere and it made no sense. Lapis listened and suggested that everything happening was because they were the only living creatures in the area. Roran agreed, saying the dead were drawn to them like moths to a flame. He said he did not want to force a decision, but asked Bros if he would move forward or turn back. Bros, seeming to feel the weight of responsibility, muttered that he did not consider himself a leader. Rora said quietly that he did not intend to make the final decision himself. Bros steeled himself and said they should press on to Hanza, since what they had been through left them no right to retreat. And Roar agreed, noting Hanza was closer than Kaffa and offered a better chance of survival. Bros doubted the whole city could fall. Roran turned to Lapis to hear what she thought. Lapis said she had no specific objections. His roar summed it up. If no one had any other opinion, that settled it. He asked whether any wagon remained that was fit for the journey ahead. Lapis confirmed they had found one survivor, but there was only one empty seat. Roaring said the zombies caused this. Lapis added that zombies and revenants do not attack horses, only those who resemble their former living selves. Bros said regretfully that the rest of the horses were gone. The drivers of the first and third carriages had taken them and ridden off. He had tried to stop them but failed, and Roran admitted it was inevitable. Declaring he would personally finish off the nearest undead, he told the others to hitch the remaining horses to the cart, asked Lapis to take San and get ready to move, and then checked whether the driver of the second cart was still alive. With concern in her voice, Santa said she had recently seen him nearby among the trees. They approached and she pointed at him. Lapis looked closer and said sadly that the coachman had already begun to turn into the undead. Roran clenched his teeth and blamed himself, knowing he was unwell but had not paid enough attention, and realizing he would not be able to give the man a proper farewell. Bros said the cart was ready, but none of the remaining men knew how to drive it, and he admitted he had never driven it himself. Lapis stepped forward with a small smile and said it was time for the priestess of the god of knowledge to step in, and Bros watched in amazement and said with respect that she was a woman of many talents, since she could even drive a cart. Lapis smiled, checked that Sana was comfortable and saw her nod slightly to show she was fine, then told Roran to hurry because everyone was ready to leave. Roran called the survivors together and said they would fight their way to the city of Hanza, adding bitterly that no one else seemed to have survived. Crassi smirked and said he never expected Roran to be the one to survive among all the participants, calling him a little bastard as if he could not accept it. Roran grinned when Crass used his phrase as if unconsciously echoing him, chuckled inwardly, and, remembering he had told the survivors to gather, admitted it was a strange but pleasant coincidence that Crass had been the one to respond. Crassus wasted no time, confirmed he had heard about the plan to move to Hanza, and immediately asked if Roran had any plan of action. Roran, calm but firm, said he had no clear plan and that if Crassus did not like it, he could suggest another path himself. Layla stepped in to ease the tension and said now was not the time to argue, and Laura backed her up, saying they needed to work together or they'd become exhausted physically and mentally if they kept fighting each other. Lauren, not wanting to waste time, urged everyone going with them to hurry, saying there was only one cart left and they intended to use it to get to Hanza. Then something unexpected happened. He shouted for everyone to lie down, and Crass, sensing danger, turned to peer into the haze of horror, his gaze darting to Angie. Lauren was amazed to see the creature. A huge, frightening monster stood before them, and he asked what kind of creature it was. Lapis quickly assessed the situation and determined it was a bone dragon, adding that not only zombies but similar creatures were now on the loose. Watching the events unfold, Angie blamed herself and admitted she had been careless. Physically unharmed, she knew she could not let others suffer for her mistake. She knew that if they took too long, the zombies would start filling the area again. The main goal was to give Crass a chance to survive and escape. Angie, desperate, shouted to Layla and Laura to grab Cross and leave immediately. Cross, hearing this, felt indignant and could not understand why Angie was giving those orders. Bros urged the others to jump into the cart at once because they had to leave immediately, but Cross refused, saying he could not and would not abandon his girlfriend and that he would go after Angie. Layla saw the absurdity and objected, saying they stood no chance against the monster in their current state, and Laura begged Crossa to think about her life. Roran watched the exchange in silence, and Lapis sighed, mockingly calling it a harem cliché, suggesting Roran use the power of friendship, since that always fixes things in those stories, then asked with a touch of irony what they planned to do. Roran remembered that his first impression of Crassus had been poor, so he felt no sympathy, and had even thought leaving him behind might not be a bad idea. He also knew exactly what it felt like to lose loved ones. The feeling was too familiar, so he could not just let it happen. Lapis noticed and, smiling kindly, said, "This is exactly why she cannot hate him." Rowan agreed with her and knew what it meant to hold on to someone who was leaving. He sized up the situation. A bone dragon could not be defeated, and they were ordinary mercenaries, not legendary knights. Still, he knew that if they did not act now, the girl's life would be in danger. Lapis explained that bone dragons don't need to eat flesh or blood to survive. They feed on negative emotions like suffering, despair, and sadness, which is why this dragon didn't kill the girl right away. His fangs sank into her flesh, extracting every drop of fear and pain. She said they had no time left, and would use magic on the count of 3 to distract the beast. That was the moment Rorin had to act. Rorin was surprised because he had thought Lapis could only use healing spells. Lapis replied cheerfully that she had recently mastered a new ability, and now had something fresh, as if it had just come from a magic oven. Rorin nodded and said he was willing. Lapis focused and chanted the magic words in a firm voice, invoking the master's name and calling the sacred light to shine. Pras watched in amazement as energy gathered around her. Loru recognized the spell and confirmed it affected only evil creatures, including the undead. Lapis firmly named her new power, Purification Magic. Rorin stepped forward at once and struck with his huge sword as light met the blade, and together they rushed into battle. Rorin tightened his grip on the sword's hilt, focused, and silently vowed to destroy the abomination's base and core. At that moment, Lapis, determined, cast the spell and unleashed a deadly lure, accompanied by a furious cry that carried pure rage and a desire to finish the enemy. Rorin turned and ordered him not to slow down. At the same time, Rorin told Lapis to return to the carriage at once. Lapis said she understood, quickly took the wounded with her, and followed him without delay. Ron watched the enemy's movements closely and saw the dragon's recently destroyed legs had already healed, making him fear it might give chase again. Roar leaned over and cursed under his breath, calling the monster a vile creature. His only consolation was that the enemy was all bone and probably could not fly. A swarm of thoughts kept him from peace. Dragons use magic to fly, so wings are more of an aid. He tried to figure out whether the bone dragon could fly. Lapis kept her eyes on the road and said the undead were too primitive to use magic consciously. This dragon probably lacked that ability. She immediately added that it did not matter now, since the horse-drawn carriage was moving slowly and could not speed up, while the monster was steadily closing the gap, and Crass, worried about Angie's condition, asked them to slow down a little so she could feel better. Rose, furious, retorted, calling him an idiot, and he warned that any delay would let the dragon catch up and kill them all, adding bitterly that they would likely be called martyrs only after they were dead. Roran ignored the quarrel and asked whether there was a high sanctuary nearby. Loru said anyone still able to use magic should keep supporting NG until their strength was completely spent. Bros turned to Roran to see if he realized that taking on such an opponent would doom them, stressing they had no chance without the High Acolyte's power and doubting Roran's abilities. Roran admitted without fear or doubt that they had lost the battle from the start. He had no illusions. Whatever they did, the outcome was already decided. Crassus, desperate, reminded them the nearest shrine was on the other side of their route, and Roran said firmly, without hesitation, that even if they all died, he forbade anyone to turn from the path, and that their task was to reach the end. Roran clenched his teeth as darkness stretched ahead, and rain clouds hid the sky. But they finally began to break, and the full moon lit the road, and he looked up to see the bone dragon still chasing them. Roran turned to his companions and warned them not to slow down under any circumstances. Lapis nodded to show she understood. Roran noticed how she rode around one of the trees with expert skill. The realization that she had done it on purpose froze him. He remembered she had once had prosthetics instead of eyes. He turned to her, surprised, and said she could really see. Lapis smiled slightly and said she could see more than ever before, clearly and unmistakably. Rory said the situation felt very strange and wondered why no one else had noticed the clear, suspicious threat, insisting it should be reported to everyone, and the bone dragon had excellent night vision. If that proved not to be true, he told them to trust their instincts and intuition, because only intuition would let them choose the best path in a critical situation and give a clearer sense of how to proceed. Lapis stared at the carriage passengers and offered a sudden, harsh idea, saying with cold irony that perhaps they should throw the stupid red-haired child out of the carriage. And Warren immediately understood who she meant and asked if she was talking about Crass. Lapis confirmed with a grin, saying it could only be her and there was no other such naive, ignorant, red-haired, overgrown child here, while Cross froze and looked at Lapis, trying to understand what was happening to Angie. Stressed, Luru said she could no longer use healing magic and could not help Angie right now. Crass, his voice raw with despair, rushed to her and begged her to hold on and not leave him. Roran, knowing panic would only make things worse, sternly reminded them not to lose their fighting spirit during the battle. Crass, seeing Roran approach, called out while trying to understand his plan. Roran seemed unconcerned by the protests, calmly saying he didn't think an explanation was necessary, and then sharply ordered Crass's to move. Caught completely off guard, Crass cried out in confusion, not understanding why this had happened to him, and before he could finish, Lapis shoved him hard, sending him straight toward the horse. Panicked as he flew, Crassus realized that if he fell, he would end up under a cart's wheels or be trampled by a horse. When he landed, he shouted and raged at his companions, not understanding what they were doing. Without hesitation, Lapis said he had a gift, the power to strengthen, and she told him to use it on the horse to speed the carriage, because if they did not do everything now, the dragon would catch them, and it would be the end for them all. Crass, still confused, shouted that Lapis was proposing to use force on a living creature. Lapis raised her voice and snapped that they had no time to argue, that this was not the time for moralizing and they had to act immediately or the bone dragon would turn them into mincemeat. Crass, looking at those who tried to save him, thought only one thing, that he could not let them die, and even if his efforts failed, he could not stay idle, so he activated his ability. The carriage accelerated sharply, jolting Roran and surprising him at how quickly they had picked up speed. Lapis looked ahead and ordered them to hurry. There was no time to relax. They had to keep moving non-stop until dawn. Roran asked what would change when morning came. Lapis explained that the bone dragon was an undead creature vulnerable to sunlight, and when the sun rose, its strength would be greatly weakened, so it could not continue the chase, giving them a chance to escape. Layla turned to Crass and called to him, clearly expecting confirmation. Bros, still stubborn, reminded everyone about the supreme sanctuary. Senna, her voice trembling, whispered to Lauren and called him brother. Roran, with a heavy look, said that despite everything, they at least now had a chance to survive. It was not ideal, but they certainly did not need to die. Waking with heavy breaths, Roran realized it was morning. They had broken away from their pursuers, but only with great difficulty. There had been losses, but the outcome was positive. Loreu, seeing he had come to his senses, greeted him softly and added wryly that the dragon seemed to have 9 lives, while Loreen looked back and said Senna had just fallen asleep, and her steady breathing eased him a little. He wondered how the others were doing and was especially concerned about what was happening to brothers. Layla, standing nearby, said she couldn't be sure. They had only just escaped, and Browse was getting worse by the hour. Roran asked if they had tried to heal him. Lila said Luru had tried her best to heal Bros, but nothing worked, so Luru needed time to rest, and Angie remained in critical condition. After a second attempt at healing, nothing improved. The wounds were too many and too deep. Layla admitted she could not be sure Angie was alive and said she looked like a corpse rather than a person. Roaring considered this and concluded they still did not know why 2 members of the squad had been taken out at once. Fate had not been kind to them. Lapis walked up to him cheerfully and saw he was already awake. With a slight smile, she said the morning felt incredible, as if it were mocking the recent events. Roran checked the cart and was relieved the horse was fine. Then he scanned the road to get his bearings and asked how long until they reached Hanza. Lapis said she couldn't be sure, but in her view, if they hadn't lost their way, the road to the city would be straight with no forks. And Roran confidently said that if the route stayed the same, everything would be fine. Lapis added that although their journey was far from an ordinary walk, she sincerely hopes nothing terrible lies ahead. Rora nodded and said he was glad to see she was okay. He reminded her that she had mentioned fabrics the night before and asked him to bring as much as possible. Lapis narrowed her eyes, mocked him as a liar, and joked that some men liked being beaten by cute, beautiful girls, but Roran refused to be teased and said firmly he had no such inclination. Relieved, Lapis said it was good because otherwise she would have felt very awkward, then called him by name and asked him to steer the horse straight. Roran asked her to move over a bit so he could sit in front, and said he had barely slept all night and felt very tired. Lapis made room for him, handed him the reins, and showed him where to sit. Roar noticed the trestles, built for 2, were cramped and suggested to Lapis that moving to the carriage roof would be more comfortable if she wanted to rest. Lapis refused, saying she was perfectly comfortable here. Warren grinned, knowing that wasn't entirely true, but he didn't argue. Roran realized that even though they had left the danger zone quickly, Their sense of safety remained fragile. He couldn't be sure they were truly safe or had only delayed the inevitable. At that moment, he noticed movement nearby, and the sun began to move, and looking at her in surprise, he quietly realized she was awake, her voice weak and confused as she called him brother. Inside the carriage, something disturbing was unfolding. Everyone felt ill as the air grew heavy, and Lauren could not take it anymore, crying out sharply while trying to understand what was happening, certain it was not a curse but clearly out of the ordinary. Senna trembled and turned to him, asking what they should do now. Rohan said bitterly that no matter what they tried, they could not help, and even healing magic was useless. All they could do was keep moving, hoping they would reach the city sooner or later. Lapis said confidently that Hanza was already very close. Roran, doubtful, asked what that confidence was based on. Lapis said that when her father came here on business, she often walked around Hanza and knew the local landscape well. And now the very land she remembered from before the city emerged was unfolding before them. Rowan let out a sigh of relief. It was the best news he'd had in a long time. He hoped this was their chance to survive. Lapis warned him not to be overly optimistic. She felt something strange. The air hummed with tension. She warned that something bad had happened here and they needed to be ready. They would have to fight if necessary. Roaring, he froze as he looked ahead. What lay before them did not match his idea of a city and was clearly abnormal. Bitterly, he said that if this was a city, it was nothing like what they had expected. Lapis was equally shocked, unable to understand what had happened, but certain something was wrong. The city gates were wide open. There were no guards or passers-by, and the place that should have been full of life lay in complete silence. If the gates had been closed, it would suggest the entire garrison had gone on a campaign, perhaps to purge the undead from Dragonshire, but all the gates were wide open, which only increased her anxiety. Roran watched what was happening and said excitedly that it was no longer clear what to do next. Lapis tried to stay calm as she spoke her thoughts aloud. Even if an undead invasion was possible, a completely empty city could still be valuable. She hoped they could restock supplies and give everyone at least a short rest, but added they had no right to abandon those still in the cart who could not walk on their own. Roran turned to Senna and looked at her with kindness and firm resolve. In her behavior, he saw the spirit that keeps her from backing down even in hard times. He promised he would not let them die and that he would overcome this test whatever it took. Entering the city, they found it oddly quiet and deserted, and Lapis immediately saw the streets were empty, with no one in sight and no sign of a recent battle. He pointed out there was no destruction or sign of violent conflict, and said none of it looked like an undead invasion. Roran noticed something odd, that despite the complete lack of people, the city still looked like it was being cared for. He admitted the feeling was becoming increasingly unsettling, and Lapis, trying to ease the mood, said two travelers alone in an empty, silent city made a very romantic scene and suggested it could even be pleasant. Roran responded without enthusiasm, and Lapis, finding it inappropriate for the moment, admitted her comment had been a joke and chuckled. Rowan shifted his attention, pointed at him, and waited for an explanation. Lapis looked at Cross and suggested he might need to be lowered, but she quickly added that she did not want to touch him. Roar agreed with this reluctance and said he would also try to avoid contact if possible, Lapis said regretfully. She felt sorry for the horse, which was clearly in trouble. Ron reminded them 4 people in their carriage were barely clinging to life and said they should leave the matter for later and find a hospital first. Lapis agreed and immediately asked Sina where a hospital might be in the city. After a short pause, Sina pointed confidently toward the direction she thought they should go. Following her lead, Lapis told the group to head in the designated direction. Roran, who had taken the reins, said he could only go straight and handed control back to Lapis. She thanked him for filling in and said it had been useful. Arriving at the building, Roran looked doubtful and said it was too small to be a city hospital, and Sina, surprised, said she did not understand what the problem was. Lapis said this was not a city hospital and, with some surprise, pointed out that the Hanza ruler's daughter knew about the small clinic, concluding that Sina's father had likely brought her here to see a trusted private doctor. Santa confirmed the doctor was truly an outstanding specialist, and said her father always brought her here. After hearing this, Lauren observed that the mayor had chosen a private doctor to treat his daughter instead of a state clinic, and she found it very strange. Lapis suggested it might be safer for now, since she did not want to visit public institutions without clear information about the city's situation, and Lauren, noticing her weariness, asked what had prompted those suspicions. Lapis said she couldn't be sure yet, told Roran to pull the victims from the carriage, and asked their companion to help him. Crass forced his head up and said he needed to rest a bit, since their escape from the dragon was largely thanks to him. Lapis reminded him who saved Angie from the dragon and made clear it was Mr. Roran. Hearing this, Press reluctantly acknowledged Lauren's merits and thanked him. Roran said the rescue was not yet complete, and that instead of talking, they should focus on moving the victims to the clinic building, and Cross, now more composed, agreed and said he was ready to begin work immediately. Roran recalled that at night his priestess had whipped Crosses without much mercy, and he had shown no obvious displeasure. The press reacted with clear confusion, not understanding what was meant. Roran suggested Crassus might simply be enjoying it. Crassus denied that firmly, and insisted he was a normal person. Roran stayed calm and pointed out that a normal reaction would have been to ask the priestess to stop. Lapis stepped in, saying Kraz would have come to his senses without that jolt. Roran smiled and said it wasn't about the method, and that he found the whole thing funny. Roran said it was all over. Lapis asked whether they had gotten everyone down. He confirmed the work was finished and said supplies remained in the wagons. There was some food among them, though not much, which was important in their situation. Lapis, relieved, said she had more good news, and that, although it was a private clinic, its medicine supply was quite extensive and useful for their current needs. Press reminded Lapis she was a priestess and asked if she had any medical knowledge. Lapis said she had some and was confident Laura had training as well. Press said Laura knew a lot about legal matters and that Angie was the group's medic, adding that Angie needed help now, admitting he couldn't have done it alone, and sincerely thanking Lapis for her help. After looking around, Lapis decided she could likely help the victims recover and chose one patient to start with. Rowan urged her to hurry, saying it would be a shame to come this far and lose someone at the threshold of salvation. And Lapis said the men should leave the room during treatment because she needed to begin medical procedures. He said he had done something useful during that time, and Crass asked indignantly whether she was really asking him to leave since the victims were his friends. Lapis calmly explained she was about to begin a treatment that would require undressing 3 girls, noted that Crasses would hardly want to watch, and asked whether he really wanted to see the girls naked. Embarrassed, Crass protested that it was not true, and Lapis added she might have to undress Mr. Bros, mocking that Crass treated staring at naked middle-aged men like a refined hobby. Stunned, Cross struggled to say he had not said that, and Lapis motioned for him to be quiet so he would not distract them as they prepared. Rorin also stepped back and began to speak. Lapis turned to him gratefully and suggested they explore the surrounding area with Sina, saying she doubted it was wise to entrust the task to Crass. She added that he would also think it a bad idea to care for Sina, and stressed that the girl would be safer with Rorin. Rorin asked if Lapis wanted Sina to stay indoors. Lapis calmly reminded her that during the treatment she would have to remove patients' clothes, including men as well, and said that seeing Mr. Bros naked could be psychologically traumatic for Sina. Rorin was surprised they'd have to undress completely. Lapis said nothing bad would happen if the men just walked around the perimeter. She pointed out that Senna is a local and probably knows her way around, which could be helpful. Lauren agreed with her points and admitted she was right. Lapis asked if she could rely on him. Rorin promised to return as soon as he felt the situation was becoming dangerous. Lapis wished them luck and said she would be waiting for their return. Senna quietly announced she was leaving with Rorin. Left alone with the task, Lapis felt a little tense about where to start. Crass, awkward though he was, urged her to begin. Lauren moved toward the exit and suggested Santa leave. Santa humbly confirmed that Lauren was ready, called him brother, and joined him. Rowan looked down what had once been a market street and saw the vegetables in the stalls were dry and spoiled, but not yet rotting, showing the event had happened recently. Everything in the shops was intact, with no sign of struggle, damage, or disorder anywhere. Some houses even had uneaten food left behind, as if people had departed in a hurry. Still, no trace of the attack was ever found. Sen looked around, surprised at what had happened to the city's inhabitants. She worried where everyone had gone, and Roran said that if the townspeople had fled in panic or left en masse, they would not have abandoned their belongings and food, since all valuables and household items remained untouched, as if they had vanished suddenly without taking anything. Roran asked Senna if she knew how many people usually lived in the city. Senna said she could not give an exact number, and Roran estimated that, judging by the city's size and development, the population was likely between 30,000 and 50,000. He thought the people had vanished, like smoke fading into thin air, and though it seemed unlikely, he decided that when he returned to Kaifa, he would report the incident to the Adventurers Guild, even if he doubted they would believe him. He said people cannot vanish without a trace. There should be at least drops of blood, bodies, or other signs of what happened. Sina spoke quietly, calling him brother. Roran realized he'd been too emotional and apologized. She said everything was fine, but admitted she was growing more worried, especially since there had been no news of her father or the other villagers. Rowan thought that if, like his parents and the other townspeople, they were still alive, they had probably taken refuge in the castle or the main residence in the very center of the city. He observed that Hanza was surrounded by walls, but the defenses did not seem intended for fighting inside the city. The main street to the residence was clear of obstacles. Admitting he would be happy to inspect the castle soon if given the chance, he realized only 3 of the 7 with him could act now, and that left them in a dangerous situation. Concluding it would be safer to wait until the other 4 had recovered before launching full-scale operations, he still wasn't sure he had enough time. Sina noticed his intense stare and asked what was wrong, and Roran said he felt watched and thought someone was nearby, guessing it might be a person or a monster. Sina pointed to the side and said she saw movement. Lauren stopped her and spoke loudly, and he introduced himself as an adventurer sent to the Hanza on an official mission, saying he was trying to find out what was happening. Then he turned to the stranger and demanded her name and an explanation of what had happened in the city. Looking tired and scared, the girl said she needed help. Lauren asked if she was a local resident. After nodding, the girl confirmed where she was from. He said in a calm but firm voice he wanted to know exactly what had happened here, where everyone had gone, and why she was alone. She explained that a few days earlier everyone had begun to act strangely. Frightened by what was happening, she hid in the basement, but when she ran out of food she had to go outside. Roran asked if she had a family, and she said her parents had died, so she was completely alone. Then he asked if she knew or had seen anyone else in town. The girl admitted she didn't know, then looked at Sena in surprise and asked if she was the master's daughter. And Roran did not deny it, saying it was quite possible that Senna really was his daughter. Excitedly, the girl said the main place they were heading to should be safe, since soldiers were there and a protective fence surrounded it. Roran noted his guess had been right and accepted that this might be the only sensible solution, decided he would need to discuss it with Lapis, and then turned to the girl to ask what she planned to do next. Excited, the girl asked to go with him. She said she could not reach the master's residence alone. As a citizen of Kanza, she offered to serve the head's family and promised to care for them. Sutel introduced herself and politely asked permission to join. Saw a thank you given politely. Crass watched the proceedings, dryly said they had found a survivor, and politely invited her in. Roran noticed that Crass had stayed vigilant as instructed. His actions showed honesty and responsibility. At first, Ruin thought Krasus was a narcissistic fool, but he now had to admit he was not all that bad, and maybe his earlier behavior came from the unhealthy environment he was in. Lapis greeted Roran and welcomed him back. Roran asked how the treatment was going. Lapis said the treatment was finished, but she could not enter yet. She then turned to her new companion with interest, noting they had not returned empty-handed. Roran said Sutel was a survivor they'd found in the city, and unfortunately, the only one they had, so he suggested they start preparing to move to the residence, while the sun was still high since now was the best time. Lapis said it was a reasonable suggestion, added that the 3 patients who had suffered in unknown ways were slowly getting better and would soon recover, but warned that Angie's case was far more complicated. Because of her injuries, her internal organs were bleeding and compressed, leaving her in serious condition. Lapis says it is not safe to move Angie in this state. Roran asked how long recovery would take. Lapis said she needed to rest for at least today. Tomorrow, Laura would likely be coherent enough to use her healing spells, By the end of tomorrow, they could carefully move Angie. Roran acknowledged that acting too quickly could cost Angie her life, and suggested leaving Cross with her while he and the others went to the residence. Lapis reacted to Lauren's plan to leave part of the group and move on without Ange, calling it cold-blooded and ruthless. Lauren replied with irony that Lapis, with her priestly background, was the one who had accused him of being callous. After a short pause, Lapis returned to the main issue and asked how they should act in the situation. Roran suggested staying the night where they were and leaving only when everyone had recovered enough to travel without risking their lives. Lapis accepted the decision and said she'd start preparing the sleepover to make sure everyone was comfortable and safe. Nearby, Sutel offered to help and arrange the overnight accommodations. Lapis politely but firmly refused her help and asked Sen and Sutel to spend the rest of the night in separate rooms. Puzzled and slightly worried, Sutel asked why she couldn't at least take care of it, and Senator Lapis stayed calm, explaining that if she wanted to work with the group, she had to follow orders without question. She said Sutel could not remain in the group if she objected or refused to follow instructions. Taken aback by the sudden warning, Sutel did not object. Santa sounded a little excited when he called Sutel, as if hoping the situation would become clearer. Lauren sensed the tension and tried to intervene. Lapis realized she had been too harsh and quickly apologized, explaining that such language came from the strict training she received as a young priestess. Still, she insisted that Sutel carry out her request and follow the instructions, saying it would not take much effort and would be feasible for her. Realizing there was no point in arguing, he humbly agreed. Lapis took the lead, invited Sutel to go with her to her assigned room, and called Sina to join them. Sina, clearly unwilling to leave her brother, turned to Roran and asked timidly if she could stay with him. Lapis replied firmly that this was impossible. Sitting down beside the girl, Warren gently explained that he did not fully understand what was happening, but he was convinced it was safer for her to stay inside the building than to go outside. He said the place was guarded by a dependable, kind man, and promised they'd definitely search for her parents tomorrow. Sina listened, agreed, and nodded, and Roran grew anxious and quietly hoped everything would truly end well, and that his expectations, despite all the oddities, would prove correct.